It's time for the Soteriology 101 podcast, where God is most glorified by his love and provision for all people. Welcome your host, the Director of Apologetics for Texas Baptists, an adjunct professor of theology, and a local teaching pastor, Dr. Leighton Flowers.
Welcome to Soteriology 101. As you can see, I have a guest with me today, a good friend of mine, Dr. Johnathan Pritchett, who is the Vice President of Academic Affairs for Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, where I also teach. If you ever sign on with Trinity, you will probably take a course with Johnathan Pritchett because he teaches almost in every single area. Is that true, Johnathan?
Almost.
Almost all of them.
Well, being in my position, I get to pick what I want to teach. So if I like it, I'm like, I decide I want to do it. So
sure.
So well, I pick and choose among the best. It's one of the perks.
Well, I've been on Johnathan about publishing his works because he writes quite prolifically via social media and other places and articles and other things. And so I'm like, when are you going to publish a book? You're working on one now, right?
I'm working on three, and since
working on three at one time.
Dr. Braxton Hunter, like you, is also on me. But for further disclosure, it's because we have the Trinity Academic Press, in which we are all affiliated. So I think part of it is you have a financial interest in me publishing a book.
That's right.
So I'm wondering what exactly is your motivation for the hurry, but I think that might be some of it, because you don't read everything I write. You shouldn't. But yeah, I'm working on 3 books right now. I'm working on a book on theological research. I'm working on a book on hermeneutics, and a little primer book on New Testament background. So
cool.
A lot of fun. A lot of reading.
I'm gonna brag on you a little bit. So close your ears, because I want you to get a big head. You've already got a big enough head as it is, from what I've been told. So
yeah, I've been told that too.
But Johnathan is probably one of the most read and well-versed theologians that I have the pleasure of knowing. And he's, not by his own estimation, but I think by my estimation, is like a young William Lane Craig. He's a very, very intelligent individual.
Well, thank you.
And every time I talk to him about anything, he knows everything there is to know about it, it seems. Like he's read so much about so many different topics, and you're not listening, are you, Johnathan? You're not supposed to be listening.
There's a secret to that. So let me give you the secret to this.
Okay.
Because people have noticed that I am a prolific reader. Obviously, people that have financial interest would like me to be a prolific writer. But I am a prolific reader. But here was the secret, and it's brilliant. What I did first, before I ever started getting a formal academic education, is I became a barber. And in a barber shop, no, I'm serious.
No, I'm following you. I didn't know you were a barber
shop, especially when you're starting out, you're trying to build a business, you find yourself with a lot of free time. And so when you work for yourself and you don't have a lot of clientele, you just sit and read between haircuts. And they tell you to never discuss religion and politics in the barbershop. That's like rule number 1 at barber college. But yet the only thing you ever end up discussing is religion and politics. And so they don't care about politics. And I was an avid reader of religions. Something my father got me into was reading. A reading family. I got to read a lot over the years. So by the time I started, like my gen ed, I was 29 years old. And I had all these years since high school of just reading tomes of academic works. So you can spend your time, and I probably still spend too much time doing this, watching movies and playing video games or whatever, or you can read. And if you get a lot of your reading done in your free time, then I found that my going through college and master's and doctorate was actually quite easy. So I just want to encourage people, especially if you're younger, but anyone of any age, to just stop wasting your time with things that are irrelevant to knowledge and start soaking in knowledge. We have the luxury of having so many books out there. Of the writing of books, there is no end, but there's a lot of them are good and a lot of them are trash, but just keep reading. That's what I tell people. So
that's good.
That's my advice. So I cheated. I had 10 years of being in a barber shop where I got to read all the time.
And get all the wisdom from all those guys you're getting haircuts from. I'm sure you had all kinds of good feedback, right?
Well, yeah, okay, so you read academic books and then you talk to laypersons. And I was I grew up in the South, so a lot of Southern Baptists and a lot of Methodists, a lot of churches in the South. So I was always talking to people who were at least, at the very least, culturally Christian, if not, born again believers who were active in their faith. And so they liked talking about it. And they when you talk to lay people, it helps you, I think, learn to translate heady academic stuff into a vocabulary that other people can understand. Right. And one of the things that I see, we're in a seminary business, both of us are, and because of your work with the Texas Baptists, that you have to be able to communicate with people. So learning that trick to where you can take all this heady stuff that we read and translate it for the folks we're not talking down to them, we're just talking to them,
right.
On their level, not down to their level, it's just at their level. And that way they benefit from that. They don't have to scratch their heads and all of this and get lost in the minutia that we sort through, because most of that minutia is not going to interest them anyway. So one thing that we see with our students is we try to do that practical thing here at Trinity, because a lot of seminarians get out of seminary, and it can take up to 3 to 5 years of pastoral ministry to discombobulate their brains from, being way up here in the clouds and not being able to relate to their congregants. So,
yeah,
we're big believers in that. Anyway, enough of that. But
well, I think you're right. I mean, there's a lot who don't translate that way very well. I know even reading some of William Lane Craig's things are a lot easier to follow through. It seems like his writing is a lot easier to follow than listening to him. And maybe because when you write something, you can take the time to translate it into something that is for the layperson to be able to read. Whereas when you're speaking, he speaks so academically, it's hard to slow him down too. You can't just like say, "Hey, pause there," Dr. Craig, and explain what you mean by that. But bringing it down to a level where people can understand and follow, your reasoning and your logic makes a big difference.
Yeah, what's interesting about him is I remember he doesn't do this so much anymore, but when he would do debates, he would do the same opening statement with the 5 arguments just about every debate. And he was like, I'll just keep using it until someone can beat it, I guess. I don't know why he did it, but he just kept doing that. But when I first started listening to him, I realized this was, back in the early 2000s when I first started getting into William Lane Craig. As I noticed, it wasn't until he got to that last point about, well, you can know, the witness of the Holy Spirit apart from arguments, like, yeah, I understand that, but it was, and the resurrection, I could kind of relate to that. But the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, even the moral argument, those first 3 points that he makes, it took me a while to actually understand what he was saying. And that's what's brilliant about it is then he shifts to the resurrection and then eventually shifts to the validation of the Holy Spirit, the internal witness, and personal experience. And I think he gets a lot of flack from that from the other side, but I think it's brilliant in communicating to either seekers or even believers who want to have some point of connection to what he's saying in these debates. That's the way to go. And I think that a lot of apologists fall into that trap of being too heady when they talk, especially in some of these academic debates, that unless you're familiar with the discussions, you have nothing to latch onto.
Right.
So that's one thing. I know that you're ahead of apologetics, and I know that you've had my boss speak at various events. That's one of the things that Dr. Hunter is really good at as well. It's, speaking to just normal church folks who are eager to learn, who can comprehend more than I think a lot of people give them credit for, right, as long as you speak to them in a way that makes sense.
Right.
So I think that's one of the things missing in apologetics. I rail on that. I only teach 2.5 apologetic, one class I co-teach with Dr. Hunter, but I only teach 2 apologetics classes here, the resurrection and then contemporary apologetics 2. And the one thing that I rail about in that class, in that course, in all of my lectures is, vocabulary. Don't alienate Christians, because apologetics is such a hard sell. We talk about being in the golden age of apologetics, but at the same time, what impact is it actually having on the larger culture? Because it continues to be progressively secular, and we're told that apologetics in the church is the answer, but why is it not being that answer?
Right.
And I think it has to do with the way apologetics is communicated. So,
Well, I know you can't, I don't think you can see my screen, but I'm pulling up onto the screen right now for everyone else to be able to see our free will debate that we are going to be having. And it's with Dr. Sonny Hernandez and Dr. Theodore Zachariades. Is it? Is that pronounced? Am I pronouncing
Zachariades? Right? Yeah. In fact, I listened. You won't be the first. I've listened to several things. He's had a couple of debates already, and he makes a point that I think one of them I heard where everyone has trouble with his last name. So
we don't have to feel bad about it, huh?
Okay. Don't feel too bad. I mean, there are a couple of sharp guys. So
yeah, no, they're both good brothers, and looking forward to meeting them in person. I've talked to Sonny on the phone for several hours, just talking back and forth about different things. And I noticed
military chaplain.
Yeah, no, he does some great work with the military, and looking forward to getting to meet him. There are two Calvinistic brothers, obviously, and disagree with us with regard to the nature of man. And
I would say they after just in my preparation so far, I think they will strongly disagree with us. But hopefully, we'll all behave as men.
Well, there's one key difference that I notice in the pictures on here is that you and I both have beards now.
Right. And they don't have beards.
This will be the first time that the two non-Calvinists will have, assuming we keep it until November, both have beards and they don't. So in our pictures,
but they're also better looking men than we are. So that might be why I have to cover the ugly. So.
Well, it's on November the 3rd, which is, I just noticed, it's 2 days after I get back from Israel. So you're going to have a jet lag partner. That should be fun. I'm going to be there with William Lane Craig, and your boss, Braxton Hunter, will be there, and Mike Lacona and Mark Middleberg, a lot of other apologists will be there. But we'll be getting it back on the 1st, and so I'm going to lean on you heavily.
I suspect I'll get more Marco Polo notifications when you and Braxton Hunter and Dr. Lacona were all at the beach. Sending me video messages saying, "Oh, I wish you could be here." And I'm at work, buried under a stack of grading.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Sure, I'll expect more of that kind of taunting. And Braxton says, "No, we were genuinely missing you. We were trying to say that we really wanted you here. We were trying to make you feel like, oh, you're being left out." And
that's not what he said before we started. Before we called you, No, I shouldn't have tattled on.
No, I think what y'all really wanted to do was rub it in, and you're just trying to save face. So
what he's talking about, for those that are listening, we were at the conference down in Corpus Christi with Mike Lacona and William Lane Craig, Mark Middleberg, but William Lane Craig wasn't there. But he was there at the conference. But on the beach, we went walking on the beach with Mike Lacona, talking theology. Braxton Hunter and I did. And we pulled up this app called Marco Polo, which is a cool app. This has been a good way for us to connect with each other. Johnathan, you introduced it to me, and it's one way for friends to stay connected because you can shoot little videos back and forth to each other, and it would be a good debate app, wouldn't it? Because it kind of forces you to stop and listen to the full discourse of the person you're talking to, and then you can reply when they're done. You also have the fast forward button, which I use regularly when you're talking, by the way, just so you know.
I don't doubt it. I can suck a lot of air out of a room. Your viewing audience is probably getting that impression already.
Hey, well, it takes one to know one, is what I always say, right? So, but I was just sent this this article. I guess it's an article or a paper. It's a dissertation, it looks like, which I know you're familiar with dissertations.
Oh, read too many of them.
You grade. That's another thing you have to read a lot of is dissertations. I've been reading my share, a couple at least these last couple of days, and it's interesting. Interesting.
Helping these students along,
That's right. Yep. Well,
I've been there.
On Facebook, a fellow friend sent me this article, or like I said, this paper. on the sovereignty of God over evil by Matt Perman. Now, this was back in 2009, so this is nothing new. And RPM, I'm not even sure what that refers to. If it was posted or published in a journal, it looks what it looks like.
For Reform Perspective magazine?
Yeah, I think that's probably, from a Reform Perspective. And so it's The Sovereignty of God Over Evil by Matt Perman. And so what I thought I would do is just like maybe read a paragraph and then we can discuss, and then read a paragraph and just see how far we can go here, because I wanted to try to give a good, robust answer from our perspective with regard to the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is what he uses kind of as his basis for his argumentation. Because one of the things I am accused of, Johnathan, as you may know, is that sometimes sometimes I on my broadcast, or we in our discussions on the broadcast, paint Calvinist as being too theistically deterministic. I know Rob Eli, one of the students there at Trinity, and several others. Eli? Sorry. Is it Eli? I've been saying Eli this whole time. I apologize, Eli. I apologize. Is he a doctor yet? Is he getting his doctorate? Master's? Or?
We can call him Eli, and then when he gets his doctorate, we'll change. But he's a great guy, but
he's a good guy.
He does think that apparently nobody understands Calvinism but him. So, and other Calvinists, unless you quote those other Calvinists.
Right, and I do.
He knows I love him. He knows I love him.
I know we both love him. But that is a big accusation that we get, is that you don't understand Calvinism, because even though we play Calvinists for themselves, I read from John Calvin himself, I read from notable Calvinists quite regularly. And
a Calvinist.
Right. And I don't know how better to represent Calvinists than to allow Calvinists to speak for themselves, but even that sometimes is not enough, apparently, to represent Calvinism correctly. And so some more moderate or lower forms of Calvinists oftentimes will say, well, you need to engage with the actual confessions, not with just one individual like John Piper or someone like that, but instead, and so usually what the order it kind of goes in is like this, is like, and I'll say my piece against Calvinism or whatever it may be, and then they say, well, you don't understand Calvinists, and then I'll quote from a notable Calvinist saying exactly what I was just critiquing, and they say, well, we don't all agree with that person you just quoted from, right. And then we say something like, okay, well, then the people who do agree with him is who I'm confronting here, so you have nothing to worry about. So I'm not disagreeing with you. Maybe you and I agree on that point, I guess, but don't accuse me of not understanding Calvinism if I'm quoting from notable Calvinists.
Here's the thing I want to point out to people. We already know that traditionalism, Arminianism, Calvinism, we already know that there is a standard to it that identifies it as such, or otherwise it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And so quoting prominent Calvinists, if you just want to disagree with all of them, then in what meaningful sense are you calling yourself a Calvinist? Right. If your brightest scholars, you don't agree with them. You could say the same thing about traditionalists or Arminians, and I welcome that, because people will often say if you move beyond the basic statement itself, or whatever your confession is, you and I would nuance things about election and foreknowledge different than someone like Dr. Lemke would, I would imagine.
Right.
So yes, there is some. I do get that, but at some point there are things that either you all hold in common or it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And when you just appealing to the confessions are just summary statements of beliefs. They're not arguments for those beliefs. And the second that you give an argument for those beliefs, we're no longer talking about the confession itself. We're talking about what undergirds the confession statements, which right. Either I can discuss that with my opponent, and if he says something similar to what all these other prominent Calvinists, if they end up saying, well, that's not me, at what point is it Calvinism?
Right. Yeah. When does it stop being Calvinism if indeed you're denying even what John Calvin and many of the most prominent Calvinists have said or argued with regard to Calvinism? Yeah,
and just to pick on my good friend Rob Ely again, at what point are you no longer a Calvinist and Elyists? I mean, if you reject every single citation we make, can you, is there, and he's not the only person that has ever done that to us. I know.
Yeah.
But I pick on him because I love him, and he has to put up with me until he finishes.
Well, and he's not alone. I mean, I get quite a few of those kinds of Calvinists, which is probably, to be honest, the kind of Calvinist I was when I was one. Had I put two and two together as even a Calvinist and have come to, the belief and understanding of what John Calvin came to believe is that the word permission is a word of the Arminian. In other words, it is unique to Arminianism or non-Calvinism, simply on the basis that if you talk about permitting, God permitting something, then what is he permitting if not the autonomous free will of creatures? Otherwise, you have God permitting himself, permitting his own decree. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so at least Calvin recognized that. He understood that using the word permission or allowing something is in itself vocabulary that we on the non-Calvinistic side use.
Well, yes, he recognizes that in his theology, but not in his exegesis of text, because you'll see him use that word in some of his commentaries that he won't allow for in his institutes. So
right, yeah, and his pastoral
it's complicated.
Ministry. Yeah, and his pastoral ministry, which again, that kind of gets into, is it a consistent theological worldview? Is it tenable? In other words, can you pastor holding consistently a Calvinistic dogma or doctrine? And based upon that very fact that in his writings on predestination and sovereignty, he bemoans those who use the word permission, even saying it's a vain refuge and childish to use that kind of vocabulary, only to use it in his commentaries and other places and in his pastoral ministries. And so is that consistent theologically to do that? But I thought what I would do here is so that you could tell when I was reading and when I'm talking myself, is I'll use my little effects thing, and that way you can tell when I'm reading the article. So I'm going to read this first paragraph and then we'll comment if that's good for you.
All right.
This is Matt Perman. The biblical teaching on the sovereignty of God is summed up well by the Westminster Confession of Faith. God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass, yet so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. And that's the end quote from the Westminster Confession. Matt continues, the issue I wish to wrestle with in this article is the fact that God has from all eternity ordained all things that will happen, which would include evil, and yet is not the author of sin. How is this consistent? I believe that by examining what is meant by the terms ordain and author of sin, we can come a long way in furthering our understanding. So that's the first paragraph. What are your thoughts?
Depends on what his thoughts inevitably want to be, because again, it gets back to the same issue we just talked about a second ago, according to him, right? So it's the language of the confession was probably the best on hand when it was written.
Right.
The problem is if it has to be re-explained as it does, because apparently he's bothering to do it with this article in Reform Perspectives, there's no official statement on this. There's what he thinks, and it seems like it's just becoming a matter of semantics to say, well, God ordains everything, but he doesn't author, and since those are two different words, we can make two different connections with respect to them.
Right.
As the statement reads itself, I kind of have William Lane Craig's attitude towards it. Well, if you're a Molinist, you can accept this. You just will unpack it differently.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Whereas that's one way to look at it. Calvinists and whether they're Presbyterian or London Baptist who copied the Westminster to keep in alignment and agreement with them on this particular issue, they can define they have their definitions of it. They will probably disallow other definitions of it or other unpackings of it, but I don't see that as being meaningful. So at the end of the day, what undergirds this statement is what's going to matter. And if you're going to insist that determinism or compatibilism, which is a form of divine determinism, is what underwrites the idea in the sense of God ordaining all things whatsoever comes to pass, then the second part of that, though he is not in any sense the author of evil, becomes a problem because of the determinism that underwrites your ideas of ordaining.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of where I get to, where it almost, knowing what the confession holds to as a Calvinistic confession, it's like that statement that God unchangeably ordained whatsoever comes to pass, but he does not ordain whatever comes to pass. That's almost like A equals not A. It's almost like, okay, he ordains whatever comes to pass, but he's not the author of whatever comes to pass. Where you hear, scholarly Calvinists, which I know I've heard and played on this podcast, of them talking about an author, even as an example. I talked about the guy that authored Yellow Brick Road and all that kind of stuff. He talked about Frank somebody or whatever.
Frank Cause?
Frank Cause. And he said, well, he's authored this book, but he's not actually in the book or whatever. And so he uses the example of an author as an example of how God ordains things. And so unless there's some real clarity of how you're defining author in such a different way as to explain the distinction between what that means from ordaining something, unchangeably bringing something to pass. And sometimes I even think some of the words they use to describe how God brings things to pass sounds more, makes God more implicit in evil than even the word author would. And it's almost like, why in the world are they working so hard to keep the word author, which even Calvin, in one of his quotes, uses the word author with regard to God as the author of evil. I'm just trying to figure out why the word author. I mean, why did the Calvinist or the Westminster Confession authors, they pick the word author to say, well, he's not that. He's the determiner of it in some way, but he's not the author of it. It seems like the word determiner is worse than the word author, or one who brings it to pass, or one who sovereignly controls every dust mite particle, all those kinds of things they use to describe it. But he's not the author. What does that even mean? And I guess that's what the article is going to get into, hopefully. But it just seems to me, it seems like it's just simply saying A equals not A. It's this A truth, but it equals not A. And you just have to accept the mystery that's involved with that. Where some people are happy to stay, it's just that God does bring it all to pass, but he really doesn't bring it to pass in such a way that makes him the author of sin, and just accepting the mystery that goes along with that.
Well, I mean, you can just take the words at face value and make them mean whatever you want to, the same way a lot of people do with Bible verses, But when you get into the explaining of it, the issue again is if determinism underwrites your idea of ordaining all things whatsoever come to pass, as opposed to a view that accepts that God has foreknowledge of what will come to pass, knowing what creatures will do, knowing what he will do, knowing what dust spokes will do, knowing what everything will do, and he acts accordingly, then you can have a little bit of a different understanding of that. Right. Whereas like William Lane Craig is a Molinist, and he would say, I'm fine with the statement as written as long as I get to unpack it on Molinist terms.
Right.
I don't know. I don't think an Arminian is comfortable with the language. I'm certainly fine with it. Ordain just means to issue a command, to bring forth something or decree.
Which is where you get into the definitions of permissive decree versus a decreative decree or a sovereign decree. And I've written on things like that myself, where I draw a distinction between that which God permits. But again, then you're stepping into vernacular that's very consistent more with our worldview, is what are you permitting and or restraining, if not the free will creatures of man?
Yeah. So, but if your understanding is one that requires a divine determinism view, then the God is not the author of evil becomes a bare assertion that makes little sense within that context.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so okay, that's fine. Prove it. And that's where, like you said, that's where some people will jump to mystery, without thinking first that maybe the fact that you have to jump there when there are ways of understanding this that don't require it is a problem with your starting presupposition.
Right.
Maybe you should get rid of that. So appealing to the confessions is one thing, but then it becomes altogether unhelpful anyway, because you got to find out what they mean. And then you can be critical of the confession if, like you and I say, okay, well, if determinism is the underwriting presupposition of ordaining all things would come to pass, then all things that come to pass do so deterministically, that's how God set up the cosmos, then you're going to have to explain things in a way that don't sound like they're either incoherent gibberish or contradictory.
Right. Well, he defines ordain this way. Let me read that section. He says this, quote, "As we will see in the scriptures below, God has not given control of history over to human beings or anyone else. He is in control. And this means that he has from all eternity ordained everything that will happen. But what does it mean to say that God has ordained everything that will happen?" Okay, now before we go on,
Was that a definition?
Well, he's just asking the question. He's like setting up what it means, I think, first. It's just the first paragraph. But he does say Scripture, he says, as we will see in the Scripture below, he says, God has not given control of history over to human beings or anyone else. But
I don't know anyone who believes that as Christian.
Well, yeah, I mean, the concept of God just giving over history, like he doesn't have any control over what comes to pass, I don't think anybody holds to that view. However, there are passages.
I don't think open theists would concede that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think even Boyd and other open theists talk about how God is going to accomplish his purposes because he's powerful enough to do so, even in an open world. That's what they believe. Now, whether you can defend that logically or theologically, that's a whole other debate. But they hold to that. But I will say, like, there are passages like we've talked about in Psalm 115, 3, that says God sits in heavens and does as he pleases. But then on down in verse 16, it says the heavenlies belong to the Lord, but the earth he has given over to man. That does sound as if there is some sense of autonomy or dominion or some level of control. We see this in, Galatians, where he talks about the armor of God and the principalities of this world and the rulers and people who are obviously given some level of power or control in this world. I don't know. It just
all under God's providence and ultimate authority.
Right.
But anyone who believes, however you want to frame it, that God has omniscience, and you want to understand whether it's because he foreordained, which I think is deeply problematic, or because he's God, which I think is, good sense for Christian theism, that he just knows all things because he's God, whether he foreordained anything or not. You accept the fact that God created the cosmos is actually here, and he knew all that would take place in the cosmos. So there is a sense in which no matter what befalls the cosmos, God decided that it would happen. Right. And right. You can get into the doctrine of concurrence if you want to, but there is a sense in which we all recognize that. And so God allowed creation to go forth, knowing what all would transpire, knowing what we would do and what he would do. So far, he still hasn't said anything that I find disagreeable, but I know where this goes. I mean, right. He decided that these things would happen. Okay. He decided this conversation would happen because God hasn't ended the world before we're done talking.
Right.
So you've still just said a bunch of truisms.
Right, which is just, again, it's a matter of permitting something. I mean, there's nothing that flies in the face of what most non-Calvinists have held to throughout human history with regard to God permitting or allowing for human actions to freely happen. But that's not what strict true Calvinist teach as far as what John Calvin ultimately taught.
It's not, and that's probably where he's wanting to get to, but they always dress it up with certain things first. But what I want to point out is that this idea, and I think you've ran into this yourselves, it is the case that all Christians who believe in exhaustive foreknowledge and complete omniscience, this would exclude open theism, is that yes, God decided to create this creation as opposed to any other creation that was possible for him to create, knowing all that would take place. The issue is, when it comes to respect to evil, the claim is that everyone has therefore the same problem. But if God set up a deterministic cosmos, whereas guys like you and I believe it's a libertarian cosmos, that charge doesn't stick, that we have the same problem of evil.
Right. Yep. Well, he goes on to say, I'll read the next paragraph here. It says, quote, "First, it means that from all eternity, God decided what would happen in his creation, without consulting anybody else and without being limited by anything outside of himself. God has decided what will happen from the big things down to the smallest details. This plan that God has made is taken as a whole exactly the way he wants it. The second thing that is meant by the phrase ordain is that God acts to bring about his plan. He does not just sit back and watch his plan to be fulfilled by chance. God takes action to bring about what he has planned. In sum, the truth that God has ordained whatever comes to pass means that he, one, decides what will happen, and then, two, makes it happen." What are your thoughts on that?
I don't understand what is meant by makes it happen. By allowing the universe to continue to exist is not him making something happen.
Right.
But if you're a determinist and you say that God has determined that certain creatures have certain desires that become the strongest, therefore they're acted upon, in that sense of making it happen, no, that gives you the problem that we always have with this statement if determinism underwrites it, which is that, no, actually, in fact, God is authoring all of the sin and the evil in the world.
Okay.
And just blustering out is not, to me, a convincing response or rebuttal or refutation of the complaint that determinism does, as a matter of fact, make God the author of evil.
Right. Well, and if you take specific examples, this is when the rubber meets the road, and it becomes emotive. Sometimes it's accused of being emotive because we're using emotional examples. But you have to kind of do that to take this out of the, the theological diadems of our theoretical languages and actually put it into the real world thing. And that's when
you have to get it out of the abstract where you can just engage in sophistry. And you have to actually do that. That's what you do in philosophy. And I understand that evangelicals are typically skittish of doing it in theology, but theology is inherently philosophical too. So you've got to test these things at the edges.
So you've got Jeffrey Dahmer, who's a heinous monster of an individual who molested, hurt, and then ate children. I mean, horrible, bad person. And you have a situation of evil like that's the people who are impacted by those kinds of heinous evil are the people who oftentimes come to the apologetic conferences and question the existence of God. And those are hard questions for any theologian to answer. Even the best of the apologists have to deal with, and how do we deal with that? And it seems like the theological worldview that is being promoted here by Matt and the Westminster Confession ultimately says that God decided what will happen. In other words, he decided that Jeffrey Dahmer would molest and eat children, and then he makes it happen. And I just find that really hard. I can't imagine any theologian actually getting up and preaching that God decided that Jeffrey Dahmer would do this, and then he made it happen, which it sounds like he's making the molestation and cannibalism of children happen. And again, I know that's emotive. We can talk about the Holocaust. We could talk about a lot of different hard to talk about issues. But ultimately, isn't that what he's arguing? If he says, if ordain means, in the way that he's describing it, that from the biggest plans to the smallest details, everything is brought to pass by God. So he's decided that it will happen, and then he makes it happen.
Yes.
Isn't that problematic for them?
Not for them. It is for the rest of us who, well, take that back. It is problematic for us, and it is problematic to the Calvinists who will say, well, you're mischaracterizing it, or you're not understanding the ways in which the means by which God makes it happen and all this, because they don't want to respond to the charge. But again, just simply saying nuh-uh to my criticism that, yeah, that's pretty horrible and God's authoring that evil himself, just because you don't like it doesn't mean that that's not the case. So, they have emotional responses to those emotional cases as well. So in my view, you're essentially saying God is the cause of making that happen. That's what that means. God is making Jeffrey Dahmer do that.
Well, and this is usually when the U2 fallacy is employed. Whenever I bring this charge to a Calvinist, they'll say, well, you have the same problem because God knew it was going to happen. He didn't stop it. So therefore, you're in the same boat as I am, which I've used the example before, and I've talked about, well, I've used several different examples. One example, I've said, well, right now there are, I think 60 children every day in Africa who starve, something like that. Do you have the power to stop just one child from starving in Africa? And the answer would be yes. Well, you didn't do it. This last month you did not step forward and help stop even one child from starving in Africa. Now maybe you are actually do have some that you've adopted, and like I do with Compassion International and other things that we maybe are helping, but let's just say you're talking to a person who doesn't help or in any way. Okay, so is that the same as if you got a child in your closet is locked up without feeding them, and you have made it happen to that person? You're making it happen. You're making that child starve. There's a huge difference between not acting to stop something that's bad, which is what we're doing when we don't save that starving child in Africa, and actually making something happen to where we're making things happen to starve a child ourselves. There is a difference between those two things. I've also used the example of a bully with with your kids. Okay, so one parent actually hires a bully to go bully his child so as to strengthen him up, to make him stronger. So I'm going to hire this big guy at the school, and hey, I'll give you $20 if you go bully that kid, just talk bad about it, do all that. That's one thing, versus a bully who freely acts to bully the child, and the parent in both situations is helping the child through that situation and helping to strengthen them for a good reason. But one of them actually hired the bully to go do it. The other one is just responding to the bully who acted freely. But yes. Do you see there's obviously a difference between those two things.
Yeah, if you hire the bully, you're responsible.
Right, exactly. And
authored that situation, so to speak.
You've authored it, right. And so both of them are dealing with redeeming the situation of a bully. You're both trying to make it better, but you can't. But you've ultimately undermined your trust between your child and you. If they find out, if somebody comes along and says, "Hey, did you know your dad hired that guy to do that to you?" That parent automatically becomes culpable in that child's mind, and thinking to themselves, "Okay, my parent who helped me, who acted like they were abhorred at what my bully did. They acted like they were really upset at what that bully did, and they helped redeem that situation with me. But now I'm finding out that they actually are the ones who hired the bully to do that to me." That child's not going to trust that parent anymore. And I think that's sometimes what Calvinistic or more deterministic kind of theology does to a lot of lay people. Is there somebody comes along and says to them, "You're telling me God actually hired the bully? God actually meticulously brought you back. He made that happen for his own purposes." That's when I think it undermines the holiness of God and the character of God in his redemptive plan.
Well, and you're not alone in that assessment. The problem with the idea that we have the same problem is not just the fact that we admit that the bully's operating in opposition to God's will for creation, right?
Right.
Whereas the parent hiring the bully is actually hiring the bully. So he's kind of authoring the whole situation and then intends to punish the bully for doing exactly what he hired him to do.
Right.
We don't have the same problem because your favorite guy, James White, says this a lot. He says, well, you got to take the account of the whole scriptures, all that the scriptures have to say. And I'm like, amen. Yes, you do. And the reason why we don't have that same problem is one of the charges about having a cosmos with creatures that possess a degree of freedom is that, we believe that God reacts to us. And they're like, how awful. Why is God just merely reacting? Well, it's not the case that in a libertarian cosmos, God merely reacts. The case is the phenomena of Scripture, if you read all of it, you have a God who is active, you have a God who is proactive, and yes, you do have a God who is reactive to his creatures. Right. And that's taking in the whole counsel of God. And you can't just screen all that out and ignore the fact that, God actually does react to what his creatures do. That's the data of Scripture that you can't ignore.
Right.
And so I have no problem saying, in a cosmos where libertarian creatures do things, God does react to them. You can't flatten all those out to just being entirely anthropopapisms as if, we all know that God determined all this stuff. He's just making it look like he's reacting in the text so that we can understand it. Then all of a sudden, too many texts become disingenuous texts.
Right. Yeah.
So determinism is a faulty hermeneutic altogether, but it is a presupposition of the Calvinists that they bring to every text. It's not a hermeneutic principle. It's a presupposition that they bring to their hermeneutic task, and they insist upon it prior to actually reading a text itself.
Right.
And, that's fine. I bring a presupposition of libertarian free will to the text, but this is what I'm going to argue in our debate, by the way. There are no texts that require a deterministic presupposition included with your hermeneutics.
Right.
There are no texts that require that. But there are texts that do require a libertarian presupposition, or they make no sense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, even passages that are oftentimes used as typical proof texts for Calvinists, like Pharaoh being hardened. Well, that to me seems to only support the concept of libertarian freedom, because what is there to harden if God's already meticulously controlling everything that Pharaoh wants to do? In other words, the fact that stands out so much to us is because he's acting in such a way as to blind Pharaoh and his rebellion. It doesn't make a lot of sense that if God is controlling everything that ultimately Pharaoh does or doesn't want to do, that all of a sudden he would start speaking of Pharaoh at times being hardened and other times hardening himself. It would seem to be saying, oh, well, God is ultimately controlling everything that Pharaoh does or doesn't do. It just, or even controlling the king, as the river flows, he controls the mind of a king.
The heart of a king is in the hands of the Lord.
Right. Again, that proves to me.
It's a text of submission. That's, you're talking about the king who wrote it.
Yeah.
Placing his heart in the hands of the Lord to turn it this way. It's a text of submission. Anyway, Proverbs 16 and a bunch of different chapters in Proverbs get, I think, in my opinion, abused to death. But in any case, even let's assume the deterministic reading is the correct one for that. Well, you and I aren't kings, and neither is the Calvinist. So it doesn't follow that. So is your heart.
Well,
and if you're saying,
I was just going to say, in proof that God can control the determinations of a king doesn't mean he always does control the determinations of a king. It only shows that he has the power to overrule even the king's choices, because in those days, kings were seen as gods themselves. And for God to declare, I can control and I can overrule even the king's choices and edicts.
Right.
And it doesn't prove that he always does so. Plus, what is there to overrule? What is there to restrain? What is there to permit, if not for the fact that he has freedom otherwise?
Right. It's just a submission text anyway. It's not a deterministic proof text.
Right. Okay. Well, let me go into the testimony of Scripture that Matt gives in this argument, where he gets into some of the key passages that support divine determinism, or the Westminster Confession of Faith's view of God, bringing all things to pass, but not somehow being the author. And so let me read. It's called the Testimony of Scripture. Quote, "We see this in many scriptures. Ephesians 1:11 says, quote, 'We have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will.'" First, notice that God works, or in other words, brings about all things. Everything is brought about by God. Second, notice that God does this according to his own plan, quote, "the counsel of his will," end quote. This plan was not governed by anything external to his own will. It is the, quote, "the counsel of his will." Thus, quote, God both chooses what will happen and also works it out according to his plan. All right. What say ye?
Well, there is a huge chasm between Ephesians 1:11 and the statement from the Westminster Confession of Faith, because Ephesians 1:11 does not say that God ordained from all eternity all things whatsoever come to pass according to the counsel of his will. It says, also we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to his purpose, who works in erguntos, which is, present active. God is at work. All the things, if you understand that Ephesians 1:11 starts in the middle of a sentence, you start going back. It's actually Paul's longest sentence in the Bible. You can understand that no matter what occurs in time, all of these things, these spiritual blessings in the heavenlies that God has stored up for believers, will obtain.
Right. Yeah, and it was just like the Calvinist.
That's not all things whatsoever come to pass there's a context to this.
Right.
Well, it's just beginning of
it's exactly what Calvinists will oftentimes argue, which I agree and concede, and oftentimes that all doesn't always mean all when talking about people. That there are times in scriptures when it clearly is talking about all nations or all peoples or all people groups or things of that nature, and I concede that fact. I think there are times where all does mean every single individual, though, and especially with regard to some of the passages that we've discussed before. But this is the same kind of hermeneutical principle.
That's never been a sticking point with me. That all doesn't mean all without exception, because the question, that's irrelevant. I can say, sometimes all is contextually limited to its context. And sometimes people say, well, all means all kinds of people without distinction. And I'm like, sure. But does that all kinds of people without distinction include every one of the all kinds without distinction, without exception, or not? So that doesn't answer the question. So it becomes a meaningless point for the Calvinists to always make hay about.
And so whenever he says when he says all things, it's all things in the context of what he's talking about, all the spiritual things that are predestined for the believer in him. That seems to be the context of that big sentence, as you mentioned, to conclude.
Sentence by Paul.
Yeah, to conclude that he is predestined. The rape of children, the Holocaust, the not only that, but the desire for Jeffrey Dahmer to work. In other words, he had to have an intention. Well, who determined his intention? Well, according to this strict definition, God is the one who made it happen. That's using his quote earlier, or as Piper says, brought it to pass. Well, Jeffrey Dahmer's intention did come to pass. It did happen. And therefore, you have to conclude, according to their definition, that God had made it happen or brought it to pass that Jeffrey Dahmer would have that heinous desire to molest and eat
the only
children.
reason that God can, on determinism, on soft determinism or compatibilism, the only way that God can determine that any state of affairs obtains is that an agent is determined to have a strongest desire in which he'll act upon for that to obtain, that he decreed to obtain. So God, the only way on determinism that can guarantee that is if that agent has that as his strongest desire. Now, never mind the problems. I think you quoted me on your blog. Somebody, you'll read it if you don't want me to go through it again. Never mind the problems with this strongest desire idea in compatibilism being philosophically, biblically, and theologically bankrupt. It's still a problem, without getting into all that God has to ensure that desire is the strongest one for which the agent acts upon in order for what God agreed to obtain. So God has to make that desire or that intention present, makes happen. How that is not authoring it, I haven't the slightest. Now, I heard a debate that you had with a compatibilist who says, well, it's both and. Yeah, but the and wouldn't be there if it weren't for the both. So there's no way to guarantee that the and would, that the agent would desire that over some other evil desire, even.
Right. Right. Yeah,
among plenty of evil desires.
You're not even trying to argue that we're talking about this agent, this Jeffrey Dahmer, being able to, please God or not. We're not even arguing that. We're just saying he can refrain from eating a child, can he?
Yeah, he can decide to blow something up or to rape an adult as opposed to eating that child. He can choose between any number of evil things. So just saying, well, he's acting in accordance to his nature. But why is his strongest desire to eat a child at the time that God decreed his strongest desire, except for God determined that be his strongest desire, right, which flies in the face of James because sin and evil come from our own desires, and God has nothing to do with it. I think James makes that clear in 1:21.
But God knew that it was going to happen, and he didn't stop it, so it's the same exact thing, right?
No. No.
That's usually where it goes. I mean, almost every single time you bring these to this point.
The reason why we don't have that same thing is because we understand redemptively that just because God allows evil to happen, you're a sinner and a Christian. I'm a sinner and a Christian, and there's a lot of sinners who aren't Christians, right? And this goes all the way back to the fall of the cosmos. We can't demand of God to say, God, you knew the cosmos was going to fall, so why didn't you stop us from getting the just deserts of our own behavior? See, judgment doesn't just come at the end. Judgment and punishment for sin is meted out, and the consequences of a fall. We can't demand of God to take back his own punishments that we have coming and continue to have coming the more often we sin. But the problem is God is not making people sin or authoring sin or passively decreeing, and somehow through some mysterious ways the inevitable conclusion ends up where you do exactly what God willed you to do in all eternity or whenever it is. Of course, this guy's saying, no, he's making it happen through time too. And I think Calvin would say the same thing. That's apples and oranges. We believe that at least traditionalists and Arminians believe that God is the reason why God permits evil is, number one, he will make it all come right for those who love him, right? But number two, and he can bring about justice later, even if he doesn't in the immediate present. But number two, God is not merely just setting up all this sin to occur so that something good could come of it. God is a reactive God. God is a pre-planning God. He's a proactive God, and he's an active God. And so, but he's still going to let the guilty and the punishment and the consequences of all collective human sin, that was piled up on Jesus. If you're outside of Christ, you're still going to, or if you're, a Christian like us who commit sin, God is not going to just stop allowing the consequences for sinful actions and the damage that does to God's good creation that sin defaces. He's not going to just say, oh, well, just because it makes you unhappy, I'm going to fix all of this without any sort of,
right. Well, and if God just steps in and kind of prevents certain things from happening, like he just steps in and tries to stop certain things, like he picks and chooses, okay, I'm going to stop this thing, not this thing. I'm going to let this thing happen, not this thing that happens. Then you just kind of have a form of a deterministic world in a sense, because you've got God stepping in to stop what the natural flow is of free creatures acting according to their own fleshly desires. And it seems to me that, some Calvinists make the false dichotomy that either this is purposeless evil is what I've heard them say. Well, at least the rape of a child, or at least this horrible work of Jeffrey Dahmer and all that things, at least it has a purpose in the Calvinistic worldview. Under your view, it's just this purposeless thing. Well, and I always push back and I'll go, well, sure, it had a purpose. It had a purpose that's called evil. It's an evil purpose. And it's not a good purpose. It's a man trying to gratify his own fleshly, horrible, heinous desires. That was its purpose. God's purpose is to redeem that which is heinous and evil. That's the good purpose. That's why we consider something of God versus something that's not of God.
Right.
And so what makes it a good purpose is that it's of God. What makes it an evil purpose is that it's not of God. It's of the devil, or it's of this immoral creature. And so if you ultimately categorize everything as being brought to pass by God for his glory, then what is the line between that which is evil and that which is good? Because ultimately everything has a good purpose behind it. And that purpose is to bring God glory.
The two wills bells out the Calvinist here, because number one, it's gratuitous and unnecessary. And number two, I mean, you have text in Jeremiah, this I did not command or decree, nor did it enter my mind. God distanced himself in the strongest, most possible way that he can. That what they did doesn't mean that we reject that he didn't know about it. Of course, he knew about it. But what he is saying explicitly is, I had nothing to do with this coming about and these people doing this, and they're going to be punished for it. Did he know prior to it? Yes, he knew in eternity past. That's not the issue. The issue is God in no uncertain terms says he has nothing to do with this, that they would do such a thing.
Right.
But then to circumvent the clearest statement of disassociation by God and say, yeah, but God also has this other will where he did intend that.
Right. Yeah.
Is that's not even hermeneutics. That's just
yeah. No.
I was gonna say, because it's bull turd.
Thanks for cleaning it up. I appreciate that.
Right, I'll show you. How do I phrase this?
Well, here's Matt.
But you can see that, right?
Yeah. No, I mean,
no matter how emphatic God can make something, to have a invention that goes underneath it and say, yes, but that doesn't address the fact that we have an understanding of that's just the prescriptive will versus the decretal will, where or he did actually decree and command, and it was in his mind in eternity past that they would do this. He devised it. Yeah, that's totally contrary to the text. And once you have an invention that trumps all plain exegesis in your system, you've already, it is so impossible to communicate with people like that who just appeal to something that has actually no basis in the text.
Yeah, just taking that last sentence of that last paragraph we talked about, in the sum, in Matt saying, in sum, the truth that God has ordained whatever come to pass means that he, quote, decides what will happen and then makes it happen. So the burning of the children of Melech in Jeremiah 7 that you just referenced, where God himself said, I did not command this, it didn't even enter my mind. Matt would have to interpret that to say, well, they burned the children of Melech because God decided that would happen, and then he made it happen. And yet he also told them that didn't even enter my mind.
And it was of God's mind that they do that since eternity past.
Exactly.
Now, irrelevant. You and I agree with the Calvinists. Yes, God foreknew if he created this cosmos, that would inevitably happen over the course of history. That's irrelevant to what we're saying. What we're saying is we believe the text. But if you have something that's extra biblical, like the idea of a decretal will that's different in sense than his prescriptive will, to override just plain meanings of the text, I think Dr. Harwood pointed this out. You can't trust the text.
Right. Exactly.
And the discussion's pretty much over at that point. Wills operate in a way that we can get our mind around. God has an antecedent will where he doesn't want anyone to sin, and he has a consequent will. But if you do sin, these bad things are going to befall you, and judgment and even just the natural course of consequences of events and evil are going to befall you. And yes, God's people have to live in the midst of that suffering until the eschaton, but that's something we can get in mind around, and God's not to blame for it.
Right.
But this system that evokes all this extra biblical ideas that you can't root in the text. If you want to talk about two wills of God, talk about antecedent and consequent. Don't talk about one that is somehow mysterious, but we can talk about it in so many ways that I don't understand how you can call it mysterious at all if you know so much about it. That God decrees these things and wants these things to happen when he says he had nothing to do with these things happening.
Right.
If this trumps the plain meaning of the text, this is your Bible, not the Bible.
Right. Well, let me read the other three verses. He brings up three more verses in this next paragraph, one of which we've already kind of touched on, the king's heart, out of Proverbs 21:1. But let me read this section to you, and then we'll comment. He says this, quote, in Romans 11:36, we read, quote, for from him, through him, and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. End quote. Thus, all things have their source in God's eternal decrees. All things are brought to pass by God's almighty power. And all things as their ultimate goal, God's glory. In Proverbs 21:1, we read, the king's heart is like the channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. Daniel 4:35 says, quote, and all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, why hast thou done so? So what is your thoughts on that?
My thought is every time I hear a Calvinist read any proof text, I say, amen. And anytime they offer their inferences from those texts, I say, oh, goodness.
Yeah.
I don't see, for me, I'm a terrible theologian to begin with. I like to deal with texts and passages more than I really like to deal with topics, but I don't see how any of his inferences follow from Romans 11. Yes, you and I believe that all things are by him, for him, and through him. We believe that.
Right.
I don't understand. So in what way does that bolster their case that God makes all things happen?
No, all things have their source. He even says all things have their source in God's eternal decrees. He that's the inference he draws out of.
That's not what Romans 11 says.
Right. But that's what he's saying. All things, so include in moral evil has its source in God's eternal decree. In other words, Jeffrey Dahmer's intention to rape and molest a child has its source in God's eternal decree. That's
well,
all,
there
what's
would
he
be no
saying.
Jeffrey Dahmer if God didn't issue a decree to create the cosmos. That says nothing. That goes back to what we talked about at the top of the discussion.
Right.
I don't mind the word decree if you just make the word mean what it means in any dictionary available to anybody anywhere. Let's just issue a command that something happens, like God decrees this creation, knowing all things that will come to pass. That's not what he's trying to argue for, though. What he's trying to argue for, is there creation? Everything in creation, including us and our capacities, have its source in God.
Right.
That's not even a point of contention. What doesn't follow from that is that all evil intentions and all evil desires have their source in God making it happen.
Right.
And if he's defining ordain and decree as God making it happen, I could go with saying God's decree of creation makes what occurs in creation certain, but that's different than saying God is making it happen.
Right.
Unless you just want to say something so innocuous and vague that by God continuing to allow the cosmos to be here, that's making it happen. But that's not what he means.
Well, right, because the Calvinists unequivocally, Calvin himself and many Calvinists argue that he knows that which is coming to pass because he has determined that which comes to pass. And that's exactly what he argues for up here when he says what he does about God decides what will happen. That's first. In other words, the order here, he decides what will happen, and then he makes it happen. So that's, that's what Calvinists teach. And this is where we oftentimes hear from the Elys of the world, where they try to argue that we're making Calvinism into too much of a determinism. But the Calvinists unequivocally say that he knows it because he determined it. And so when they try to appeal to the U2 fallacy of trying to say, well, you believe he knew it and didn't stop it, so that's the same thing. No, it's not. It's not the same claim. There's two distinct things here. You're accusing us of something that we don't actually claim. We're actually critiquing your actual claims, that are the claims of actual Calvinists. Yes. That's what we're coming up against. And you are coming against your own philosophical conclusions about God's omniscience. That if God in his eternal knowledge knew all things and didn't prevent it Therefore, it's the same as him determining it or bringing it to pass or making it happen. And we're saying, no, it's not the same. And I think that's where guys that continue to accuse us of not understanding Calvinism or not representing it rightly have to read these things and apply them with the actual vernacular that the Calvinists themselves are using.
Yeah, Dr. Hunter reviewed a book for the Baptist Journal of Theology and Ministry. I think it's out today, actually. I think Adam Harwood I think he's editor of that, and he posted it. And the book that Dr. Hunter reviewed for this current issue by a guy named Christensen, I can't remember the name of the book, but he openly admits, Calvin compatibilism is determinism, and we need to stop trying to, beat around that bush.
Right.
Let's just own up to it. And I think D.A. Carson would agree with that. He wrote the foreword, so I guess he's signing off on that too. Yeah. Just saying you're a compatibilist does not say that you are not a determinist, because this is something we need to clear up for our Calvinist friends who say we don't understand Calvinism, even though they've never read Paul Helm or this Christensen guy or others. Even though we read these Calvinists for whatever reason, it seems like a lot of people we talk to don't. But compatibilism is the compatibility of two things. Free will, defined as acting upon your greatest desire without constraint, is compatible with, guess what?
Determinism.
So
theistic determinism. Yep.
Yeah, compatibilism is not a other thing. It is a deterministic thing. So I just say determinism because you're a determinist. If you're a compatibilist, you are a determinist. And if you strip away the side of the coin of compatibilist free will, what are you stuck with? You're stuck with just determinism. So you can make a distinction. It's determinism compatible with free will on compatibilist terms. Okay, let's look at one half of this. Let's set aside the free will side of compatibilism. We have asked the question repeatedly and have never gotten an answer. So hopefully one of the Calvinists who hates your guts, the uncharitable ones who hate you, because I see their stuff on social media. You do have those. You also have ones that are very nice.
Oh, yeah.
So after they get past the criticism that we're just talking about a bunch of philosophy and not really dealing with the Bible, as if we can't have philosophical conversations, Christendom is. Anyway, I'm getting too sidetracked. So the Calvinists that hate you, set aside the free will side of compatibilism and tell me what is the difference between a hard determinism and soft determinism in practice. Look, here's the free will puppies, okay? I think determinism, we'll call it vomit, okay? We're not going to look at the puppies. You still have the determinism, which is part of compatibilism. How is that not equivalent to hard determinism?
Right.
How does calling it soft determinism when you eliminate, we're just going to analyze this tree instead of the whole forest. We're just going to look at a tree. John Piper says we can at the beginning of the justification of God. It's not the end of all scholarship to look at one tree. So let's look at this determinism tree half of this compatibilist forest.
Right.
What's the difference between that and hard determinism? We've never gotten an answer.
Yeah, no, and plus, what is it that's unique about compatibilists that hard determinists wouldn't sign off on? In other words, are hard determinists out there going, no, people aren't acting according to what they want to do? No. In other words, even the hardest hard determinist is not out there saying that people aren't doing what they want to do. They would also agree, people are doing what they want to do. Yeah. In other words, acknowledging that people are acting according to some kind of...
phenomenologically, in our experience, in an observation, it looks like that's what they're doing.
Right, exactly. And so that's all I'm saying. In other words, it doesn't seem like you're making any kind of qualification by quote-unquote saying you're a compatibilist than just to come out and say you're a hard determinist, because there's nothing that it's like what the Calvinist says, God also ordains the ends and the means. Whenever you talk about evangelism, we believe God ordains ends and means. Okay, so what are you all you've said is God determines not only the ends, i.e. the salvation of the elect, but you've also said that God determines the means by which that elect person will hear the gospel. Therefore, God determines both. So all you've said is God determines everything. Therefore, if I don't participate in evangelism, I can say, God didn't ordain for me to participate in evangelism. He ordained for somebody else to participate in evangelism so as to lead the elect to the Lord. I'm going to sit at home and enjoy another episode of Blue Bloods because I haven't watched all of it yet. And I would rather do that than go across the street and witness to my neighbor. And I don't really have to go witness to my neighbor because though that neighbor will be saved if he's elect, I don't necessarily have to be the one who witnesses to him because, after all, if he's elect, then God will ordain for someone, whether it's me or someone else, to do that. And I'll have a desire to go and witness to my neighbor because God will give me that greatest preset desire within the circumstances. Again, it's just hard determinism. It doesn't say anything to say that God ordains the ends as well as the means, except to say that God determines everything, which is what we already know you have claimed.
But Calvinists understand that determinism is vomit. I have heard Douglas Wilson say, I've heard Matt Slick say, and guys like that, well, I'm not a determinist. And then they affirm everything that you could say about determinism and compatibilism. Like, yeah, that sounds like good Calvinism. Yeah, that's good. Okay, then you are a determinist if you agree with this. Right. No, I'm not a determinist. So, okay, you are.
Let's. I know Calvinists are going to push back on. Okay, well, then how do you answer Romans 11:36? For from him, through him, and to him are all things. Well, wouldn't free will be all things? So, in other words, by creating a free moral creature, i.e., Jeffrey Dahmer, you can say that it's from him that all things, including free creatures, are from him. In other words, God has brought to pass a world of free libertarian creatures. So it's just like what we've talked about with the Psalm 115:3. God sits in the heavens and does what he pleases. But you can't beg the question by assuming he's pleased to create a deterministic worldview. You're begging the question by assuming that's what he's pleased to create. What if he's pleased to create a libertarian world? In other words, if we say, like Tozer says, that God has sovereignly decreed not which choices we'll make, but that we'll be free to make them, then that is also being brought to pass by God in the sense that he hasn't decided what Jeffrey Dahmer will choose to do, but that he has decided to create people who have the freedom to do what Jeffrey Dahmer has done. And so in that sense, we can say God has, quote unquote, permissively decreed this. It is from him in the sense that it comes to pass because he's created free moral creatures who have mutability, the ability to fall, but that he has not decided or he has not made it happen. He has not decided what Jeffrey Dahmer will do and then make it happen, as this Calvinist argued earlier. Would you agree with that?
I would, but I again, that part of Romans 11 is like Ephesians. It's doxological for one.
Right.
It's saying Paul is getting into all of this stuff with that is like saying by all things that includes lima beans. So let's talk about lima beans and let's make sure that we include lima beans in our exegesis of Romans 11 and make sure that
all things mean all things. All things,
right? And so
lima beans too.
I mean, I have a problem just taking this text and applying it because it says all things. So we got to figure out how lima beans and determinism and actions of men fit into what Paul's just trying to, give a doxological praise to God, because God is the source of all things, including lima beans. But like you said, you're either going to beg the question that this means determinism is true, which is an odd passage to use to make that point, or all things, including are the ability to have real moral choice,
right,
in a libertarian sense. And so this passage really doesn't make any sort of claim one way or the other for either side of this debate. So I don't see it as helpful.
Well, we already talked about Proverbs 21, so we'll skip that one, go to Daniel 4:35, and which says, "And all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing."
Yes.
Which we would all agree with. In comparison to God, the inhabitants of the earth are as nothing. I think we would all, conclude that.
Amen. Again, amen.
But even
determinism is true is a non sequitur.
But even think about that statement. The inhabitants of the earth who are determined by God to do what they do are counted as nothing. So are you calling the determinations of God nothing? Because if God has determined the inhabitants of the earth to do what they do, and you're counting them as nothing, then aren't you discrediting that which God has brought to pass? See, it seems to me that by saying all the inhabitants of the earth, by saying they are counted as nothing, you are contrasting the free creature, autonomous free creature, as opposed to the holy, good God. And it seems like to me
Almighty,
powerful God, right. So it only makes sense that if you have a separation between the inhabitants themselves and God, that kind of a statement that all the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing actually makes more sense in our worldview than to say that God has ultimately brought to pass everything that the inhabitants of the earth are and do, and that is really nothing. So you're calling God's determinations nothing versus calling us, autonomous free creatures who do sinful things, nothing. It just seems to make a lot more sense in our worldview. It goes on to say, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. We all agree with that. He does according to his will. Of course, God does what he wills. But again, you can't beg the question by assuming that he wills to bring to pass child rape. You can't assume that he wills.
Deterministically.
Yeah, through compatibilistic quote unquote means.
This is my problem with proof textology. Like I said, I'd rather discuss passages and topics because anytime I do this with traditionalists, by the way, and Arminians, anytime I see somebody using a proof text that really doesn't have much to say about whatever topic they're discussing, an angel loses his wings, and I frown. My countenance falls, and a kitten dies because it's so annoying. Careful thinkers don't do that with texts.
Right.
In any other realm of dealing with literary analysis, doesn't treat any book in the world like the Bible gets treated.
Yeah.
And we're the ones who treat the Bible, Christians, worse than literary critics and literary people who do literary analysis in the humanities, and others treat the literature they deal with.
Right.
And that makes me sad.
Yeah.
It's like everyone learns hermeneutics and then decides to chunk it because they have a theological agenda. Now, that's not to say proof texts don't support theological statements. They do. But again, I don't see where Daniel 4 adds anything to the discussion of God making things happen in a deterministic sense.
But it says, Johnathan, just to be the devil's advocate here, not that he needs one, but no one can ward off God's hand or say to him, why hast done that? Don't you think the libertarian theologian actually believes that we can ward off the hand of God? Isn't our will more sovereign than his will? Can't we, because we have free will, aren't we able to thwart the will of God?
No. Calvinists seem to think that libertarian free will is a lot more powerful than any person who affirms libertarian free will. Because I don't see how I can thwart God's hand. Let's suppose that libertarian free will is true for the sake of argument. Ask the Calvinists this. Okay. Hey, thwart God's will. Good luck. Have fun. Go try. See what happens. Right? Jonah, let's assume it's true. Jonah tried. Guess where he ended up? Nineveh. Guess which direction he headed off in the opposite direction. I don't get, it's like R.C. Sproul is a dear brother in the Lord who says exceedingly dumb things with an alarming regularity that we should worry. And the opening of Chosen by God seems to have the suggestion that if like a molecule that God created, by the way.
Rogue molecule. I remember that part. Yeah,
right.
A rogue molecule.
He's trying to make the analogy of anyone with free will is the connection he's making there.
Yeah.
Like this rogue molecule can lay waste to all of God's plans unless determinism is true. And I'm like, how feckless and wimpy do you think God is? Talk about a small view of God. R.C. Sproul has a tiny view of God. That God can't accomplish anything.
It's almost like saying if I've got one ant in my house, that I'm not controlling, then that ant could take down my whole house. As if I don't have the ability to go crush.
Whole family too.
could go crush that ant anytime I want to.
Right. I mean, my goodness, that's why. And I know what they're doing. R.C. Sproul, like James White, and a lot of these they get all passionate, and then they want to set up what is technically a straw man, just hyperbolic statements of, passion to get you against what they're thinking. But if you step back and think about the statement they made, you're like, wow, that was kind of stupid.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of dumb that you said that. Like R.C. Sproul, if he should, I would be embarrassed if I wrote anything like he wrote in the intro to Chosen by God. But that's just me. Well, dear brother in the Lord,
he's trying to support his view. We understand that, but I mean, it's just the analogy that I've used before in talking about this is comparing God's sovereignty and his power to overrule man's will with my strength. In other words, my physical strength. So over my daughter, for example. Okay, I have the physical strength when my daughter was 3 years old, I had the physical strength to hold her down and force feed her if I wanted to. But if I chose not to do that, if I chose to instead use my words or to threaten her with punishment if she refused, that kind of thing, does it mean that my muscles are now weaker than hers? Does it mean that I don't have that as an option in my tool belt if I so want to do it? Of course not. It means that I can choose to do what I want with my child, and I can use my physical force. If it comes to that, I can use physical power over her. I have that ability, but because I don't choose to use that physical force over her doesn't mean I don't have it. And that's the kind of argument that it seems like some Calvinists make, is to try to say, well, if God doesn't choose to use his quote unquote deterministic power over man's will, therefore he does not have deterministic power over man's will.
Well, forget deterministic power. I don't think God ever needs deterministic power. He just has the power to overrule man. But like you said, he doesn't always do that because he doesn't always want to do that because he has his reasons and this is where what often gets left out of the discussion is because God is wise. He knows how to best orchestrate without determinism the course of human history and human affairs and what to redeem and how to accomplish his purposes. See, God doesn't have to be. See, this is where it gets into collapses in my mind to panentheism or pantheism. To exert power, God does not need to determine both sides of whatever activity he's involving himself in at the time. He doesn't. In fact, it seems like it's silly to say God is overpowering his own determinations if determination is true.
Right.
He doesn't trump the will of man because the will of man is just the will of God too.
Right,
ultimately,
right.
on determinism. What true power is, and exerting true power is when God does override man's will. But you can only make that statement overriding man's will as coherent if man's will is not God's will.
Right. It's like Jonah's example. It doesn't make any sense if God sovereignly ordained the desire of Jonah to run from Nineveh, only for him to use a big fish to change that which he determined for Jonah to want to do. It only makes sense for God to overrule Jonah's free will, which was to run.
We get to talk about it.
Right, exactly.
In any sort of meaningful way.
Right.
And I believe that God overrules man because God is active in that he is not me. He's God, and he does things just like I can affect your mood, Leighton, if I want to. I can call you a bunch of mean names right now, and that can change your mood. I'm sure your wife could probably change your mood in different ways that she wants to if she was wanting to be nice and make you happy, or if she decided you did something. She can, our spouses can interact with us without determinism being true. Right. To affect things in our lives.
Right.
How much more can God do that?
Sure, absolutely.
An infinite amount more. You don't need determinism is just gratuitous. You don't need determinism to have God sovereign over the course of human history, to have God sovereign over salvation even. It's just a gratuitous add-on.
Right.
And an unnecessary one, and one that becomes problematic because it's not necessary for any passage of the Bible, and the opposite, libertarianism, is absolutely necessary for many passages of the Bible.
Well, let's continue with the article because he gets into a few more verses here, and I want to at least get through some of those verses. And so here's the next paragraph. Quote, "Since God controls all things, this means that evil is also under the control of God. We see this explicitly in many verses. Psalm 105:25, speaking of the Egyptians in the time period of the Exodus, says that God, quote, turned their heart to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants, end quote. In Isaiah 10:5-15, we read of how God used the wicked nation of Assyria to carry out his judgments upon Israel. In Deuteronomy 2:30, we read, quote, but Sihon, the king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass through this land, his land, for the Lord your God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate in order to deliver him into your land as he is today," end quote. The crucifixion of Christ, which was the most sinful human act in all of history, was said to have been according, quote, "to the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God," end quote, even though it was, quote, "by the hands of godless men," end quote, that Christ was put to death, out of Acts 2:23, also Acts 4:28.
7:28.
Yeah. What say ye?
I say none of those passages require determinism. That's I don't know what else to say. God did not need to make Assyria hate Israel. All God needed to do for them to be the rod in his hand is to withhold his protection from his people.
Right. Yeah.
But you don't need. But what you don't need, and what determinism requires. I'm sorry, my light keeps.
Yeah, I'm watching the screen. People who are watching the screen, like you got that squeaky loud chair, and your light turns itself off.
Motion sensor. Okay, and it's behind this.
It's one of the funniest things.
I'll show your viewers.
Yeah.
I have this tied to me from the motion thing. And so this happens in my webinars all the time. We sit in it when it's at night, it just goes completely black.
This room used to do the same thing, and I had them program it to where I actually switch it on and off so it doesn't turn off on me.
Yeah, I haven't figured out how to do that. I don't have people like you have people. I'm not quite on your level.
Yeah, that's it.
But
yeah, sure.
And of course, I love it when they bring up Acts 23?
Yeah.
Predestined, plan, and foreknowledge of God, as if foreknowledge there is not a verb of foreknowing and some sort of intimate thing, or it's not foreordaining. It just means plainly in that text, he knew beforehand, right? And then when you get to Acts 4:27, 28, all it says is that, Pilate and Herod and the Gentiles and all the people of Israel gathered together and conspired to do whatever God's plan, predetermined plan by his hand, predestined to occur. I just butchered that badly, but
no,
you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, we're following you.
My memory, it hasn't been the same since I turned 40. But all that's saying is God predetermined that the anointed one would die for the sins of the people, and those are the people who showed up to do it. Where is the determinism in that passage?
Right. Well, that's why we call the redemption of sin for the world of God. That's something God worked to help bring to pass. In other words, proof that God worked to bring about redemption of sin doesn't prove that God brought about all the sin that needed to be redeemed. And so using examples throughout human history like Pharaoh in the first Passover and godless men like Judas or Pilate and others in order to bring about a redemptive plan through their rebellious actions doesn't prove that the rebellious heart itself was determined by God, but that only God used based upon his foreknowledge and his ability to use people in their criminal behaviors, much like I've described it as a sting operation with a police officer. He doesn't determine for the drug dealers to be drug dealers. He just uses their already evil intention to bring about the sting operation. And so God can do the same thing. God can use already evil hearts and minds to bring about a plan like he does with the king of Assyria, who's already an evil pirate of a man who's robbing other countries and desolating other countries, and he can use them.
You don't even need compatibilism to be true in order for Acts 27, 4:27, 28 to work, because God pre-purposed something according to his plan and foreknowledge in Christ, and there's wisdom in that, which he talks about, that a lot of people don't get. And Galatians says, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son. This is all wisdom, and you don't need compatibilism makes this gratuitous. Especially, if you're a Molinist, you can really make sense of this quite easily. God knew what everyone would do in any given situation, and how they would behave, and so God can arrange history in that way to where you get that. I think that's interesting, but the text itself doesn't even say that determinism is necessary. Because what was predetermined was for the Messiah to be crucified for our sins, and these were the players who brought that about.
Right.
The do whatever, the which better translated, bring forth what God had by his hand, which is just a way of saying his great power and predetermined plan had wanted to occur. So I read that and I read that and I read that and say the conclusion, therefore, compatibilism or determinism is true, doesn't follow from that text.
Right.
Doesn't follow from Isaiah 10. Doesn't follow from Genesis 50:20.
Right.
Genesis 50:20 doesn't say God determined them to determine evil because he intended good.
Yeah.
It says they intended one thing and God intended another. And here's how you know. I think William Lane Craig and the Molinist crowd is right about one thing. God does primarily use wisdom and foreknowledge to govern creation, because we know that God is not exerting all of his omnipotence at the very moment, right? God can make your head explode and then reattach it right now and not break a sweat. God could part the Indian Ocean and then let it collapse and part it again and let it collapse without breaking a sweat. Guess what he's not doing? He's not exerting that. He's not exerting all the power he has to exert at any given time.
Right.
He always has more. But do we want to say that God's not using all of his wisdom and knowledge right now? That he's doing less than all wisdom.
Right.
He's using less than all of his knowledge right now. Do you want to say that? You first.
Yeah, that's
so
a good point.
We know,
That's a good point.
So we know that God doesn't primarily govern using his omnipotence, but he is never not using all of his omniscience and all of his wisdom.
That's good. Yeah. Well, I want to get to the part where he actually gets into the author of sin. So let's, and I wanted to answer the passages because a lot of people try to accuse non-Calvinists of never dealing with the passages. Of course, there's never been a passage I've not been willing to engage with, and you as well. And I don't
like
know.
passages better than topics.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Yeah, I'd rather dive into the passages. But
if none of the proof text, though, you better be prepared to actually have thought about the whole overall context, because I know I have.
Without begging the question that something like, well, God sits in the heavens and does what he pleases must mean he's pleased to create a deterministic world, or something of that nature. So he goes on to say this. He says, quote, the sovereignty of God over all things, including evil, is important for many reasons. This truth gives us peace of mind and security in a hostile world. For we know that our good God is sovereign over it all and is working for good. When bad things come to us through the sin of others, we can take comfort that God is working it for our good. This truth also gives us wonder and awe as we marvel at how God can even use his enemies to accomplish his plans. Now, I don't know about you, but a lot of what he's saying right there,
amen.
Yeah, that's what I would say. I say he's using his enemies. He's not bringing to pass or making his enemies do those things to accomplish his plans. He's using enemies to accomplish his plans. There's a big difference between using an enemy and making someone do those enemy things.
Sovereignty, and you've heard me say this a million times, is not a synonym for determinism.
Right.
So I believe that God is sovereign over absolutely. God is maximally sovereign, absolutely sovereign over everything, including dust motes. Okay? What does that have to do with determinism?
Right.
Or free will? Or predestination, for that matter?
Right.
Nothing.
Yep.
It has sovereignty means position of authority and rule.
Right.
But there's no higher. So whether God creates a deterministic cosmos or he creates a libertarian cosmos, he is maximally sovereign and can't be more sovereign than maximally sovereign either way.
Right. Yep.
So that you've said he's said nothing I disagree with.
So how can a libertarian, someone who believes in libertarian free will, can we have the same, quote, peace of mind and security in this hostile world? It's just like the bully world that we were talking about before. If I'm in a world where God hires the bullies, or if I'm in a world that God redeems the bulliness of the bullies, but he's not hiring the bullies, can I still in both worlds have a peace of mind and security in knowing that God is bigger than the bully, even though he may not have hired the bully to begin with? Do I have to believe that he hired the bully in order to have security in the hostile world?
I feel better with God having not hired the bully.
I'm the same way.
Because I know that God, despite the evil, for whatever reason, he doesn't just, follow our whims for him to change the way the fallen cosmos works just because we don't like evil. He still didn't author it or cause it or make it happen, you know?
Right.
But he wants good for us. Compatibilism, I hear compatibilists like David Platt, and I think it was Matt Chandler and others talk about how the doctrine of divine determinism, which is all they really meant by sovereignty,
right,
brings them comfort. And I'm like, that's easy for you to say, because, you know, it's much harder for that to actually be in any sense meaningful, because at the same time, they want to borrow capital from our worldview.
Right, exactly.
To make the medicine go down easier. But they don't use the word determinism. They smuggle that concept into the word sovereignty, which doesn't mean it or entail it or imply it. But I'm secure in knowing that a fallen cosmos has consequences that God is not going to prevent from occurring simply because it would make us happy if he did. God is a holy God. He's a just God. But I am secure in knowing that the God who didn't cause it is going to redeem it.
Right.
Whereas I have to question, you know, and however impious this sounds to Calvinists, I have to question a God who would cause it so that he could redeem it for no other reason than to show off. Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I talk about the syndrome in the sky, you know, of the Incredibles movie. And I know some people don't like when I make that comparison, but when Syndrome creates those evil robots that come and attack the world so that he can come in and conquer the robots so that he can be the superhero because he's jealous of these superheroes. Well, once they find out what he's doing, he becomes, you know, a villain himself because he's the one who's ultimately created and sent the robots, versus truly understanding that those robots, quote unquote, evil creatures, are autonomous from the true hero, autonomously separate from God, and are acting according to their own free will and desires, not according to God's pre-planned purposes in all things, that he's brought it to pass or he's made it happen. But instead
it's more glorious. It's more glorious for God to redeem evil he didn't cause than it is for God to cause evil just so that he has something to redeem, so that we will give him glory.
That's a good way to put it.
Because there is no other scenario, and you can't make God so totally other that talking about God is nonsense. But there's no other scenario like that analogy you use in which we can say, yeah, let's praise the fireman who started the fire.
Right. Yeah.
For putting it out.
Right. Yeah, no,
there's no analogy works for the ones that they want to work, but they say, yeah, but God's not a man. Well, we know that God's not a man,
right?
Even though God did become a man so that he could share in our sufferings. He didn't cause our sufferings so that he could come and share in our sufferings and say, hey, look, I'm sharing in your sufferings that I caused.
Right.
That's just so disingenuous. So from my perspective, and I know Calvinists hate one because I know they're screaming at their monitor, and we probably said something that bothered them, which we normally do anyway. It's fine. But that's just because you don't like that it ultimately collapses into that is irrelevant. That's what it is. And so God is not a man, but he's not so totally other that talking about God is incomprehensible, or that's just sanctimonious blather. God's goodness is not so totally other that saying God is good means nothing.
Right.
You know, we can approximate, and there's no analogy that works where you can, start the fire and put it out and be praised for it. And I don't think that because it's God, we can make that exception, because it's no more praiseworthy because it's the same thing. That's why it's an analogy. It's the same exact scenario. And just because it's God doesn't mean, we can move that from the category of suspicion to the category of glory just because God's the subject. That doesn't work.
Right.
But believe that if you can, and it's a free country, believe what you like, but don't get upset or fake indignant on God's behalf when he doesn't need you to and probably doesn't want you to, when we put it like that and say, God's not a special case to where he can start a fire, put it out, and we should give him glory for that.
When you were talking, it reminded me of C.S. Lewis's quote, which I think you were kind of referring to too. He says, if God's moral judgment differs from ours so that our black may be his white, we can mean nothing by calling him good, For to say God is good while asserting that his goodness is wholly other than ours is really only to say God is we know not what. And an utterly unknown quality in God cannot give us moral grounds for loving or obeying him. If he is not, in our sense, good, we shall obey, if at all, only through fear, and should be equally ready to obey an omnipotent fiend or an all-powerful demon. The doctrine of total depravity, when the consequences is drawn that, since we are totally depraved, our idea of God is worth simply nothing, may thus turn Christianity in form of devil worship. In other words, if as you've heard said, well, God's not a man, and so you can't judge him by what we would call good or not good, C.S. Lewis' argument make a really strong argument. Okay, so then the best you can do, if you can't call God good in our sense of the word good, then you can only say God is I know not what. And I've heard Matt Slick and other Calvinistic apologists argue about what is considered good and not good, and even talking about, okay, is it ever good to torture babies, for example, for your own pleasure? And they talk about, no, that's not good. Well, how can you claim that that's not good or that's not moral if God doesn't exist? And they're using the moral argument to argue for the existence of God when talking to an atheist, but they're doing so based upon the I think objective reality that it is wrong. We know it's wrong to torture babies because our good, we can, even as totally depraved creatures, recognize that's not good. That's not right. That's not what God is. And yet the Calvinistic worldview ultimately says God is the one who makes that happen, using their quote from the same article.
Well, that's not going to, our buddy Robbie Lee was saying, that's not my view. That's Perman's view.
Well, hey, yeah, but he is quoting from the Westminster Confession here, and he's arguing from the Westminster Confession.
Right, which is why appealing to the confessions means nothing, because one man's underwriting of it from a Calvinist perspective is not going to be another Calvinist perspective of how to underwrite it. And so, that's the trouble we get into that we talked about. So we could talk about this, but we're not, at the end of the day, we're going to have Calvinists say, well, that's not how I understand it.
Right. Well, then stop.
And of course, we don't understand Calvinists, and of course, you and I were never Calvinists ever.
Right. Well, then stop claiming to be a Calvinist and come over to our side and start arguing along with us and debating people like this, because there's a lot of them out there.
Yes. So, if all these Calvinists that disagree with one another would have their own debates, we could just back and let them clear all this up for us. Which is the canonical Calvinism and which isn't.
Right. Okay, so here he finally is getting into the author of sin here. So let's hopefully we can get to this. I know we're kind of going along here, but I wanted to get to this portion at least. Understandably, however, for many people it is hard to be, I only use my effects mode here so you know what I'm reading. Quote, understandably, however, for many people it is hard to be comfortable with this truth because of a pressing question. If God brings about all things, good and evil, why is he not considered the author of sin? As we saw in the Westminster Confession of Faith, and as we know from the Bible, a proper view of God's sovereignty believes both that God brings about all things, yet he is not the author of sin. How can this be? What is meant by the author of sin? We will come a long way to solving this difficulty if we understand what is meant by saying that God is not the author of sin. It means at least 5 things. 1, God never commits sin. 2, God is not the positive cause of sin. 3, God cannot be blamed for sin. 4, God does not approve of sin. In other words, he hates it and justly punishes it. And number 5, God does not ordain sin for its own sake. So what say ye on that?
That's a lot of, this is what it doesn't mean. That's not any, this is what it means.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
By negations. So what?
He never commits sin, but he makes it happen. He hires the bully, but since he's not the bully himself.
You do it. So you can't tag God with being responsible because he made you do it and you're the one who performed the action. That's what he's saying. That argument doesn't wash, though.
Because my greatest desire was to bully, and my greatest desire at that moment of choice was determined by my nature within my given circumstances, both of which were sovereignly ordained, i.e. determined by God, and therefore God determined my desire to bully. but he's not committing the bullying himself. He's not doing the bullying, so he's not committing the sin, so therefore he's not to be blamed for sin, even though he did determine, he did bring it to pass, he did make it happen that I would desire and thus choose to bully.
Yeah. I mean, this is why Frankfurt examples don't work for compatibilism, because you can't appeal to you can't appeal to natural secondary causes if you're not a naturalist, because God has ultimately manipulated the secondary causes for your desire to be what it is.
Right.
So divine compatibilism is like a Frankfurt example where the chip just stays on. Do you know what Frankfurt examples is? Explain it. All right. They try to defend the compatibility of moral freedom. Okay, so you want to go into the voting booth, okay? And a mad scientist that you don't know about has put a chip in your brain,
right?
Okay. If you have the choice between Hillary and Trump. Now, if the chip is programmed to go off to make you vote for Trump, if you don't vote for Trump, if you try to go vote for Hillary, the chip will go off, make you vote for Trump.
Right.
If you vote for Trump, nothing happens. Right. And that's and let's say you're a guy and you want to kill somebody with a gun. If you back out at the last minute, the chip will kick in and you kill the guy anyway. But if you kill him, the chip doesn't make you do it because you went ahead and did what you wanted to do. Okay, you can come up with a million scenarios like that.
Right.
The chip makes you do something if you were about to not do it. But since the chip doesn't go off, you're responsible, even though you couldn't have done otherwise, right? Because you chose to do it, the chip never went off. But if you couldn't have done otherwise, because you would have killed him because the chip would have gone off.
Right.
But the problem with divine determinism is the chip always stays on.
Yeah.
In every instance.
Right. Yeah.
There's no meaningful way that you can say, if God's making it happen, that there is no chip.
Yeah.
Right. So they say you're responsible because you wanted to do it.
Because
you
the
could
chip
have done otherwise, but you wanted to do it. Now wait a minute. That relies on Frankfurt examples, but in that example, you have the chip that will make sure you do it. Right. That doesn't get you off the hook, because in divine determinism or divine compatibilism, the chip's just always on, because in their understanding, God is the determiner of all things.
Right.
Right. Not if you don't want to do it, God will turn the chip on to make you do it. So, because the idea is if you did it anyway and the chip never worked, you couldn't have done otherwise, and so you're still morally responsible. That doesn't help divine determinists, though, because in divine determinism, if you're going to make these grand claims, like our guy here makes it happen, determines all things, whatever, the chip stays on. Now, what also gets left out of these is the fact that who's morally responsible if the guy wanted to back out. It's often overlooked. He can't back out because the chip would have kicked in, removing his choice.
Right.
So if he did commit the murder because of the chip, not because he freely chose to do it, even though he could have done otherwise, but he did it because of the chip, is the mad scientist culpable or not? Well, of course he is.
Yeah.
Because the guy would have backed out, but he can't back out.
Yep.
So, and divine compatibilism, because you can't just appeal to Mother Nature or whatever if you're a theist. You're dealing with divine determinism and compatibilism. The chip stays on.
Right.
And so God would be analogous to the mad scientist. And so you can't remove that responsibility because, and I know they hate it that, pre-programmed and robots and all that. Well, as soon as you can explain how we're not, well, I know they don't like us using puppet analogies and stuff.
Well, how much more or less control?
But if you can give me an explanation of how it's not like that.
Yeah. Well, how much more or less control does a puppet have over its puppet master than a lump of clay has over its potter in the deterministic way they interpret the potter and clay analogies of Paul?
Well, in that sense, the Bible got it wrong, because the potter flawed the clay instead of the clay becoming flawed in the hands of the potter.
Right.
The potter intentionally flawed it so that he could make something else with it that he was going to make with it already in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I know exegesis just becomes impossible with this. You know,
it does. Yeah.
The Bible can't just say what it says.
Yeah. Versus having pots that have become flawed because of their own free will, which is what we would believe, and therefore shaping that now hardened lump of clay into something that brings about redemption by crying out, "Crucify him!" by being cut off and grafting in the Gentiles and all that's involved with that exegesis of that text. That God
we're clay that can repent, and God will stop bringing the disaster He planned against them. We're clay that can repent. And I love Jeremiah 18 because Jeremiah 18 also gives man's doctrine of total depravity, and then God's response to it, which is, of all the days, who's heard such this, you know? But Jeremiah 18 is not a popular passage for Calvinists.
No, it's not. Okay, so...
But all you've read from this guy is 5 things it ain't.
Right. Yeah, so he goes on to say this, and he goes on to say he goes through these 5 points. God never commits sin. In other words, He's not the one who ever does sin. And he goes and reads passages over that. He reads passages. God is not the positive cause of sin.
Right. He gets down to different kind of causes, I think.
Yeah, because it's like the hiring of the bully versus being the bully yourself. God's not actually being the bully Himself, but he quotes from D.A. Carson here. He says, to put it bluntly, God stands behind each evil in such a way that not even evil takes place outside of the bounds of His sovereignty, yet the evil is not morally chargeable to Him. It is always chargeable to the secondary agents, to the secondary causes, i.e. those who actually do it.
Yeah, but I could say the exact same thing and mean something completely different by those very words. He hasn't explained anything. He hasn't given us the mechanism. He's just made a bunch of assertions,
right.
Just like the confession just makes assertions. Explain that.
And when you read from monergism.com the article of a compatibilistic scholar who actually does get into the mechanisms, where he says about, men act freely because they're acting according to their greatest desire, but those desires and the nature that determines them and in the circumstances are all determined meticulously by God's providence. And therefore, we do believe in hard determinism, is what the guy from monergism.com, John Hendricks, goes on to argue. And so when I quote directly from those guys, then you get James White responding, not realizing I was quoting from his own scholar, and saying, well, you're flattening it out. It's more diamond-shaped than that. It's more multi-orbed than that. And ultimately what they're saying is we don't want to get into the details of how it's actually brought to pass, because if we get into the details of how it's actually brought to pass, then you're looking behind the curtain and you see what we're actually saying, which is just plain old hard determinism.
Every time James White complains about not talking about a fully orbed diamond-shaped compatibilism in the third dimension, I want to tear my hair out because he never explains what that actually is.
Right. No, he never will.
You're flattening out. What is a non-flattened orb-shaped diamond, diamond-shaped 3, why not 7-dimensional buckaroo banzai across the 8th dimension? Why is it? Why 3 dimensions? Why not 7? What is it? What are you talking about? And of course, he never says.
It's his way of saying.
Have you heard him say what he actually is talking about?
No, he does, and he won't, because
he just says, "Well, you're flattening it out. It's not diamond shaped."
It's his way of appealing to mystery, but he can't appeal to mystery, which would be honest to say we don't know the answer to that question, like Calvin says, like Sproul says, like MacArthur says, like Piper says. He can't appeal to mystery because he's already ridiculed those who do appeal to mystery. So he mocks people who appeal to mystery, and so he can't use that vernacular, and so he uses things like, well, you're flattening it out and you're making it double, diamond. It's more diamond shaped than that. Yeah. That's his way of appealing to mystery. It's his way of saying we don't know.
I hear him say that stuff. What does it mean?
Yeah.
That doesn't say anything. That's like D.A. Carson's quote you just read. Well, it's like this. Well, that doesn't explain anything. I believe that God is sovereign over all evil occurrences. I believe that God, he stands behind them in the sense that he didn't stop them,
right?
And he lets them come to pass. He foreknew they would come to pass. What's the mechanism of how they came to pass? Is it because of the self-determination of sinful agents? Or is it because God makes the sinful agent have the desire to bring about the sin?
Right.
Which is contrary to the Bible.
Which he's already made the positive claim earlier that God desires it to happen, then he makes it happen. He's already said that about every single little small detail earlier in this same thing. So we don't have to guess as to what he's saying. We know exactly what he means by it because he's already said it. And plus, for our side, you may think, well, what about the passages where it seems to say God brings this to pass or that to pass? And Calvinists do this a lot too, where they'll appeal to the idioms or the anthropomorphisms of the scriptures and things like that.
God brings a ton of things to pass.
Yeah. And
God's acting in the world. You don't need compatibilism or determinism for God to make things happen.
Right.
Why bother? Why did God decide to be active if you have a deterministic cosmos in the first place?
Right.
It could have just been dominoes.
Yeah. Well, and it's just like the metonymy, the idiom metonymy, where you give credit to things because of an absence, like the White House put Iraq into shambles. Well, the White House didn't literally go put Iraq into shambles, but by taking out the armed forces, it allowed for Iraq to act freely, and therefore they put themselves into shambles because of their own, metonymy, their own autonomous actions. Same way, there's a lot of times in the scripture where it blames God or it puts onto God things that people do because God permitted it to continue.
God says, "I did this."
Right? Yeah. It's blaming somebody for something that they didn't do, but because they didn't prevent it from happening, they're given charge.
Text limitations or text names that Job. Yeah. I don't have any problem with any of those passages. Again, it's the amen to the Bible verse and the oh me to their explanations of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very true.
And what way do these things work? And I think, of course, if you read I had to go wave again to get the thing. If you read pre-Augustinian fathers, they unanimously understood, as far as I can tell, that it was a withholding of provision and grace is how God would bring about judgment, right? Especially when they were reading the Old Testament text. It's not that, God's going to go play with the Assyrian army as if there is G.I. Joe men and make them march. It's just they wanted to do this. God knew that before the foundation of the world, and he often did step in to give incredible victories to Israel that he was no longer going to do. He's going to say, they're going to have their way and you're going to lose.
Right.
And I have no idea what God was doing to cause him to, but God can do things without compatibilism being necessary to make things happen in the world, just like I can make things happen in the world. How much more can God make things? Forget compatibilism. Just assume libertarian freedom is true. I can make things happen in the world. How much more can God do it on a large scale without determinism being true?
Yeah, no, you're right.
I don't understand why you add this in.
Yeah, there's no reason for it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just agreeing with you. There's no reason to add that extra part in.
It seems to me that the disciples of the disciples, everyone prior to Augustine, thought that it was unconscionable to be a determinist.
Right.
They use terms of necessity, but it amounted to the same thing. They unanimously affirmed what could only be classified as libertarian free will.
Oh, absolutely.
Every reputable scholar would acknowledge that.
Well, even John Calvin has a quote acknowledging that. I mean, and most Calvinistic historians who are not just trying to win the debate acknowledge that. And they usually point out other mistakes that the early church fathers make in order to discredit maybe their views. But I skipped ahead in the article. And
while not discrediting Augustine by the things they don't like about Augustine.
Well, exactly. Yeah, it's a double standard. Yeah, Augustine's all good. Yeah, right. Well, I skipped ahead to the permission aspect of this article because I wanted to read, kind of went through his 5 points that he made there. But I'm skipping down to, he asked the question, what is meant when we speak of God permitting something? And here's what he says. Let me read it. Quote, this is a distinction between positive and negative causes. It shows why we sometimes speak of God as permitting something. When we speak of divine permission, we are not saying that God gave control of the situation over to the human will to let it do whatever it would. Rather, we are referring to the means that God used to bring about the action he had ordained. We aren't denying that God caused it, but are trying to get across the fact that God is behind good in a different way than he is behind evil. Thus, we speak of God permitting something. We mean that he could have prevented it, but deliberately withheld the grace that would have prevented it. What do you say to that?
Jibber jabber.
What do you really think?
That's jibber jabber.
Yeah, he's in other words, he's affirming that God caused Jeffrey Dahmer's desire to molest a child. He said that. He said, because he says we aren't denying that God caused it. So when you have Rob Ely saying we don't believe God causes it. We don't believe God causes it. Here's a Calvinist, that is quoting from the confessions and arguing that he's saying we're not denying that God caused it, but we're trying to get across the fact that he's behind good in a different way than he's behind evil. What does that mean? And so in what way is he behind good different than he's behind evil?
Here's where it becomes gibberish. God causes this, but he's going to permit what he caused because he's going to withhold the grace to allow what he caused.
Right. He's permitting himself. It's like because if he's decreed and caused all things, which is, he already claimed that earlier. Yeah. If he's decreed and caused all things, therefore he's permitting something that he decreed. So he determined something to come to pass and then permitted that thing that he determined to come to pass. It is nonsensical.
Yeah, gibberish.
Pure gibberish.
It's just gibberish. It's here. That's when they, not Ely, because he may have his own form of Calvinism, and I know that not all Calvinists are monolithic, but this guy's at least somewhere in the middle. He doesn't want to get tagged for what he knows he's going to get tagged for, but he still hasn't explained anything. All he says is that God decrees and makes happen and doesn't stop his own happenings from happening.
Yeah.
Okay. That becomes a tautology. You've said nothing.
So
what that doesn't do is doesn't get God off the hook or in any way give God a different relation to the evil than he has to the good.
Right. Well, like when he talks about the twins in Romans 9, and Calvinists talk about, well, before they have done anything good or bad, I always have to remind them that remember that the good and the bad that they do has been determined meticulously by the sovereign will of God. So God is not taking into account what he has determined for the twins to do in order to choose which twin he's going to use to bring about his noble purpose. That doesn't make a lot of sense either. So within the deterministic worldview, it doesn't make sense to speak of God choosing people prior, quote unquote, or without regard to the things they do, unless you're acknowledging that the things they do, they're doing of their own free autonomous will. Otherwise, you've got, Esau and Jacob both doing exactly what God made happen, caused, and yet somehow in his sovereign plan didn't take that into account when he chose to save one of them and not the other. It makes absolutely no sense. Even their own interpretations make no sense when you apply the overarching deterministic worldview. They're trying to
apply that text to something that has nothing to do with it in the first place.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, we both I think understand that, but at the same time, but I'm just granting it to them. I'm granting that, okay, so he chose Jacob over Esau before doing anything good or bad, but acknowledging at the same time in your worldview, the good and the bad they did was ultimately brought to pass, i.e. decreed by God himself. And therefore God didn't take into account what he decreed for these boys to do.
Well, they're both
when
bad.
choosing them. Yeah, they're both sinful. We both understand that he chose one of them for the noble purpose to bring his plan through, regardless of their morality.
Right.
But that's nothing to do with their individual salvation. But he goes on to say, okay, let me keep reading and see if any more clarity comes here. He says, while that last statement has proved very helpful in clarifying my understanding, it is incomplete by itself. As we saw earlier, God's permission doesn't mean that he ceases being involved in the situation. God is still controlling the situation. Permission refers to the means God uses to control the situation. Thus, we must understand that God's permission is a directive permission. This means that God, by means of negative causation, is able to so arrange the situation that the option that he has ordained will necessarily occur. Does that help any?
Gibberish.
All right.
Number one, I don't know what he found so helpful except for sophistry, because the first bit of gibberish that he seems to find so helpful didn't explain anything.
Yeah. No, I
made
agree.
more assertions. And this doesn't, I don't, that was so incomprehensible. And I'm a smart guy, and yet that was just, that doesn't, let me look at this again.
So it even says God is controlling the situation.
Yes, I got all that.
Permission refers to the means God uses to control the situation. But what is he permitting if not the libertarian free choice of a man? He's permitting, again, it goes right back to what we said. He's permitting something he's already caused. He's permitting his own control. It's like kicking the dog and saying, okay, I'm going to permit myself to kick the dog. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's a directive permission.
He does it through negative causation, so it's fine.
Yeah. Well, whatever that means.
We should accept it because he says it. Do you know what that means?
He's able to arrange the situation that the option he has ordained will necessarily occur. So the option that he has ordained will necessarily occur.
That's a bad use of the word option and necessary.
Yeah. It seems to be doublespeak. We saw, he goes on to say this, we saw a glimpse at how God does this in our discussion of negative causation and secondary causes in the book, The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination by Loraine Bottner. And I may be pronouncing his name wrong. There is an insight that will perhaps shed more light on how God uses negative causation to direct the course of sin. Our sinful natures will always go to the boundary set by the permission of God. Hence, God's bounding of sin renders certain what and how much will come to pass. Satan could go no further with Job than God permitted, but it is certain that he would go as far as God allowed. God's permission is like a fence that he put around sin. He can move the fence to give sin a large area or a small area, and sin will always go to the boundary permitted by God. Thus, God can determine what sin will do by setting its boundaries at the spots that will bring about what he has ordained.
Not on compatibilism, it doesn't, because that doesn't ensure. See, that goes back to what I said, the sophistry thing. Hone it into Jeffrey Dahmer, right?
Right.
And why this eating of a child as opposed to robbing a bank or whatever other evil impulse he could have. Right? Why this sin and not that one?
Or to use his example of the fence. Okay, I've got a baseball behind the fence and I've got a softball behind the fence. Okay, both of them are behind the fence. So what is determining me to pick the baseball over the softball? In other words, you still got, if you're talking about the meticulous divine determinism, God's not only determined that I would be in the fence, he's also determined that I would pick the baseball over the softball, even within that fence. So you can't use this fence kind of analogy, this boundary kind of analogy, and also at the same time say that every single minute detail, dust mite, all those kinds of things are ultimately controlled by God, while at the same time using an example of this kind of permissive language of boundaries. Right. That's stealing from our worldview, like you said earlier.
Right. It's not only is it stealing capital, it's like this nonsense about how God is supposedly restraining all the evil he never occurred to take place in the first place.
Right.
Doesn't even make any sense.
Right, because how would that stuff come to pass unless God, quote unquote, decreed it in the first place? Right. It's like James White argued about a baby dying. He was arguing with somebody about, well, this baby that died may seem horrible to you, but you don't know that baby may grow up to be the next Hitler. Well, how would that baby grow up to be the next Hitler if God hadn't ordained for that baby to grow up to be the next Hitler by following his greatest set desires within the given circumstances that were all ordained and decreed by God? It doesn't make any sense to say that God would kill a baby in order to prevent him from doing what God would have decreed him to do if he wasn't killed.
Right, because you could ask James White, who dealt God the cards on what he would grow up to be. How does God have this factual knowledge if you poo-poo modalism all day long?
Yeah.
So he's borrowing capital from the Molinists to make it could have grown up to be Hitler.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm glad to know that he's warming up to Molinism then.
That's not more of a Molinist argument. It does. Okay, so he goes on to argue, says, God cannot be blamed for sin. And he says this, because of these things, it should be clear that God cannot be blamed for our sins. They are our own fault because we are the ones who do them. God is not forcing us to do them by simply making use of the evil that we are by nature. And because God is behind good and evil in different ways, he is the ultimate cause of sin, but not the morally guilty cause of it. What do you think about that?
More blather and assertions, but no explanation of mechanics. He still doesn't explain anything. He just says that God stands in different relations.
Yep.
Okay. What does that mean? Negative causation and secondary. Okay. What does that mean? How does that stack up with your other claims about him making it happen? So he's saying God is the ultimate cause. Well, I can say that God is the ultimate cause by allowing the universe to exist. So what? How does that God getting active and making things happen, like his earlier claim was,
right,
but not being guilty of it, even though he's not? He's more than just the final cause of it. He's
right,
the efficient cause too, or he's not making it happen.
So
you can't have it both.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So okay, let's take a book. Let's say Desiring God by Piper. And let's say the Calvinists read that and agrees with every word that John Piper says, or even talking to John Piper himself. Okay, was God behind the writing of Desiring God by John Piper? Okay, a Calvinist would have to say, well, obviously, yeah, he decreed for the writing of that book, and you also agree with it. You think it's true. Okay, so it's a good thing, and so God's behind it. So how does that differ in how God brought about the writing of Paul in the New Testament? Both of them you think are true. Both of them think are good. Both of them are brought to pass by God, by his decree, sovereignly, unchangeably. So why do you call Paul's writing inspired of God, but you don't call John Piper's book, Desiring God, inspired and of God? Because he's standing behind both of them. And even further,
because of the difference of means by which Paul would have been borne along by the Holy Spirit to produce those words, where John Piper just arranged the words in such a way that God was happy to permit, that he decreed, that aren't brought about in the same mechanisms by the various modes of Scripture. That's always an interesting conversation, though, because they always want to, because then you can I understand where you're coming from, and I know their responses, but they always say, if libertarian free will is true, then how did you get Scripture in the first place? That's what they throw back at us. We say, well, if God stands behind everything and decreed every word of every thought of John Piper when he wrote a book, then even Lady Gaga's music is,
decreed sovereignly by God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which it is. It's caused by God. Lady Gaga's lyrics are, right, according to this guy, were decided by God and brought to pass, made to happen by God. So.
Right, and they'll say, but because the Holy Spirit didn't bore her along in the process of that, it's in a different category than Scripture. Okay, whatever.
But both of them, but they would have to admit, both of them were brought to pass by God for his greatest glory. So how can you bemoan the lyrics of Lady Gaga? How can you complain about the lyrics of Lady Gaga while at the same time saying that God brought those lyrics to pass for his greatest glory?
Oh, because part of God's decree is also for someone to bemoan it, so that people would, by God's decree, recognize the bemoaning and understand that that's bad and this is not bad.
All right. So the only reason you bemoan the lyrics of Lady Gaga is because God has sovereignly ordained for you to bemoan those lyrics, not because they themselves are wrong, in error, and not of God, but you're bemoaning them only because God has decreed for you to bemoan.
He also decreed that they be wrong and in error. And decreed me to bemoan them. I mean, it's fun playing devil's advocate
but how can you call it wrong if it's but how
everything
can you
becomes it is?
Well, how can you declare it wrong though? Because it brought God glory. I mean, it's decreed to bring God glory. So how can you declare it bad ultimately, because it's controlled by God? It's brought to pass by God.
Bad. No sin is ultimately bad, because it'll all be inevitably and ultimately bring God glory. So no sin is ultimately bad in that sense.
Yeah, that's part of the problem, is that you don't have a difference between the purpose being evil and the purpose being good, because everything has a good purpose ultimately in God's sovereign decree, because all things are ultimately brought to pass by his sovereign decree for a good purpose. So everything, including the Jeffrey Dahmer actions and intentions, are according to God's decreed purpose for his glory. It's a good purpose
Leighton
behind
Flowers, you just don't understand Calvinism.
it. Apparently. Well,
Right.
we've gone too long, and there's more to it here. He goes on to say God does not approve sin. He hates it, and he justly punishes it. God permits something. It's because he wants it to occur, all things considered. But God only permits what he has purposed, and everything that God permits in this sense happens. And so he gets more into
Causes
permission.
it and permits what he causes. That explains nothing. It doesn't explain how God is not morally culpable for the sin by causing what he permits.
Yeah, no, it goes back to the same thing.
Where's the escape hatch? Where's the mechanism that gets God not authoring the evil? This is why, and Calvinists need to pay attention to our discussions like this. And after they get all their complaints, it's that they need to understand the implications of their ideas from people who are critical of it. And unless and until I get a good response, the charge still stands. Determinism ultimately makes God the author of sin, and saying "nuh-uh" is not a response, a rebuttal, or a refutation.
What I like to do is I say, okay, let's pretend that God did author sin. How would it be different? In other words, try to explain to us what it looks like for God to actually author sin, and explain how it's different from what you're describing here, where you're saying that he has brought it to pass, caused it, controls it, but he's not authoring it. There seems to be a distinction without a difference. It's like, again, it gets back to the blather issue.
Well, there are Calvinists like R.C. Sproul Jr. who recognize this and have decided to throw in the towel and just say, yes, God is the author of all sin and evil. Get over it. God can do as he pleases. Right.
Well, and the higher Calvinists have kind of come over there to say, well, it is what it is. Just who are you to question God then, if God does these things, and you know, if you just can't understand how good he is, because his good is, you know, looks like bad to us, but that's because you're a totally depraved individual, and that goes back to the C.S. Lewis argument, is that we might as well be worshiping a really powerful demon. I mean, we could be. After all, if his good is our bad and our bad is his good, then we're worshiping we know not what, right?
Roger Olson, the Arminian scholar, certainly believes that's the case.
Well, yeah, he made the same argument. He said at least the devil is honest. At least he didn't act with one hand saying, you know, this is what I want of you, and on the other hand causing something different. At least the devil is forthright with his desires and his intentions. Whereas God, underneath this kind of systematic, seems to be duplicitous in some ways, at least. Now, we're not trying to say Calvinists say that God's duplicitous. Well, we're making the charge that if what they say is true, it would appear that God is duplicitous. And so we're not trying to be accusatory by saying Calvinists believe God's duplicitous or God is a monster. We're saying that if you take these things to their logical conclusion, you would have to come to that. You would have to come to the conclusion.
Well, you don't have to take it very far to see the logical conclusion. So it's not like we're taking it further than what they say and say it ends up here, right? We're saying it's already there.
Right.
This is the conclusion. Saying "nuh-uh" is not a meaningful response to that. Just because that's all it amounts to is, well, our confession says it's not, and we don't believe it. Well, okay, explain how that works. Crickets.
Yeah. Or diamond shape. It's diamond. It's more diamond shaped. It's more diamond shaped than that.
Diamond shaped, fully orbed, non-flattened in the third dimension.
Oh! Why did you say that in the beginning? Oh,
right.
Well, that clears it all up.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. What does that mean? You know. And again, you know, when you read, as you've been reading things like this, you see how much philosophy is actually in this, right? He's making a lot of philosophical claims.
Of course it is. Yes.
And so just I wanted to make people aware. And I fully admit that our view of traditionalism, all theology is inherently just brimming with philosophy, because theology is inherent. That's why Aquinas called it the handmaiden of theology, because theology is impossible without philosophy, because you're doing philosophy anyway. So when somebody's going to complain that, they didn't talk about the Bible much, well, okay, we talked about some texts, but you can talk about things that are related to philosophical ideas that are related to theological ideas, because they're all inherently philosophical. So I just want to put that out there before someone gripes. And I also want to put out there that Frank Baum is the name of the guy who wrote the Oz books.
Yeah. I think that was the one that, and I can't think of the Calvinist guy. You would recognize his name. Big, heavy set guy. I think Presbyterian, not a normal Baptist kind of Calvinist, but he used that analogy. I listened to him on a podcast, and I cannot think of his name. It'll come to me.
Wilson?
No. Yeah, try Doug. Yeah, Wilson. Yeah, he's the one that uses the author analogy, and using, how he actually uses that analogy in his debate with Stephen Gregg.
Yeah.
And he actually uses the analogy of the author who's not actually in the book himself. And so he's not the one who's causing those things that are bad that are happening in that book, but he's over it, and he can, he's author. And so it's funny how he's using the analogy of God authoring it whenever they're very insistent that God's not the author of sin. But yet, I can't think of anything more meticulously deterministic than an author of a book.
Well, if you're going to be doing a poor job of defining things as a series of negations and not actually give a positive definition, you can get away with that, because all authoring is it doesn't mean these things.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, it's pretty much the only, he hasn't told us that's what I was talking about before. What would it look like for God to author sin? What would that look like? Because because then you would be defining it positively. Okay. Here's what it means for God to author sin. It means that he, actively brings it to pass versus hiring somebody to bring it to pass, hiring the bully versus bullying himself, and therefore for God to be the author of something. Well, the authors aren't doing it themselves. The authors are the ones who are writing about somebody else doing it. So author doesn't necessarily mean that one is doing it. I mean, if I'm authoring my son to be bullied by hiring the bully, I'm still separated. There's a distinction between me and that bully. And so again, there's no explanation here as to how in the world, and even that's what even Calvin even admits, that he's meditated on these questions so long he's not afraid to admit ignorance as to how God is not implicated in our wrongs, having been the one who determines them. He admits mystery on that point, and he has to. I don't see how you can get around it within the claims of the Calvinistic worldview. And not come to that conclusion. And we appeal to mystery too. I think we appeal to mystery before blaming God for sin. We just say he's not the one who brings it to pass. Men do. We just don't know how to explain how men freely do things. But at the same time, we still acknowledge that God is not culpable or is not bringing to pass or causing these heinous evil things. That's why we say ultimately that we're defending God's holiness. Yeah. By defending man's autonomy and free will. But we could talk about that forever, and I've held you long enough. I know you probably got papers to grade, don't you? Fun things like that to do?
Yeah.
So in other words, you want to stay here and talk a little longer?
Yeah, I was like talking to a buddy of mine on Facebook, and he was like, I'm probably keeping you from things, and that's what I'm like, no, I'm happy for you to do that, because every time, Facebook does a little ding as long as you have it in this other window. Right. I'm like, yeah, every time it dings, I have a reason to stop grading for a minute, because I like our students' papers, but man, just when you get buried in it, it's one of those times, it's springtime. So everyone's trying to rush to get finished before the summer. It just piles up. So,
yeah. Yep. Well, man, Dr. Pritchett, I greatly appreciate you coming on the podcast, and it's a lot of fun to talk through theology with a buddy, and we will continue this conversation another time. But until then, we'll see you next time.
All right, buddy.
All right. Blessings. Bye-bye.